If you have just now stumbled upon this channel for the first time, or you have not watched my previous episode where I covered the story and gameplay of End War, I will be referring back to my criticisms of that game many times throughout the runtime of this video. While I did go out of my way to try and make these two separate watchable videos, I highly recommend that you visit the End War video first. As for the rest of you, welcome to my World in Conflict retrospective. Unlike Tom Clancy's End War, I did actually play this game a little closer to its release date, even if that still ended up being something like 5 years after World in Conflict was first released on PC. Because as a teen, even with having pretty much full unrestricted access to the entire World Wide Web, I still did not realize I could literally Google something like best RTS games for PC and be met with a whole list of games that I'd never even heard about until around 2012. And that is literally how I found out about World in Conflict. Up until then, all of the real-time strategy games I had ever played were either set in or inspired by medieval settings. And maybe that one in the 17th and 18th century, I forget the name. So when I found this game, and saw these screenshots depicting massive tank battles, jets dropping cluster munitions, and what were at the time incredible looking graphics, I was sold. If you want to have somewhat of an understanding of just how much I loved World in Conflict, I first downloaded it through totally legal means onto my grandparents' shitty laptop that could barely run YouTube videos, let alone games made any time after 1998, while I was visiting them on holiday around this time in 2012. I suffered through having to play on minimal graphics and a crappy frame rate regardless, and a trackpad, because this game was so different to anything else I had ever played before that I couldn't stop. In fact, the biggest disappointment I experienced with World in Conflict was when I finally came home and installed it on my own computer. I replayed the entire campaign to the mission where I left off before coming home, finally being able to experience the game on something that was at least a little bit more powerful than a fucking toaster. And when I finally did, I realized that I was literally one mission away from beating the entire original campaign. My biggest disappointment was that I completed the whole game and that there was no more content left. Until I discovered Soviet assault, that is. But it's important to highlight this word, was, because that all happened something like 11 years ago now. And as I grew up, and more real-time strategy games came out over the years, I started to expect more. And when I look at RTS games I used to play and still like to revisit to this day, I have to say that World in Conflict doesn't surface itself in that list for me very often. So the questions really become, what made World in Conflict so damn good when it came out? And does it still hold up? And hopefully, over the course of this video, I'll be able to answer both of these questions. But before we get fully into World in Conflict, you might be asking yourself, where the hell do I even buy it? Even though I said I originally pirated the game, I did buy it on Steam shortly after, and it's this version I used to get footage for the first 2 missions of the game. But Valve stopped selling World in Conflict as of July of 2016. The reasons for this aren't exactly clear, and the only answers I've managed to find are speculations. What can be said for almost certain though is that the version of the game on Steam was different than that on other platforms, such as GOG for example. Because whereas everywhere else that sold this game had updated it to the complete edition, Steam always sold the game in a way where you received 2 different entries in your library, World in Conflict and World in Conflict Soviet Assault. Some speculations suggest that this version was unable to be patched, but the reasons on delistedgames.com also mention the inability to remove online features in this version as a possible reason behind why the game was taken down. It could be the case that Steam removed the game to prevent players who were expecting to be able to play the multiplayer modes from buying the game, as the World in Conflict servers were shut down in December of that same year. But I did say I managed to get a little bit of footage using this version of the game, right? Why didn't I go ahead and record the whole thing? Getting the game running in the first place took a couple of minutes, but ultimately all I had to do was run it in backwards compatibility mode. I ran it on XP Service Pack 2 if I remember correctly, though I've seen people online mention that Vista worked as well. But if you saw my post on Discord around a month or 2 ago, link in the pinned comment by the way, I mentioned I had just upgraded to pretty much an entire new PC. That's right. This is the absolute weapon that I started this entire channel on. Well, what I didn't realize is that World in Conflict isn't very fond of the brand new 12-core CPU that I had just installed. Windows 11 also came with this upgrade, so you never know, that might have something to do with it as well. This is where the Steam version became a problem for me. If you already own World in Conflict on Steam and have more than a 4-core CPU, then you might as well try and download this multi-core fix that I will put at the top of the description. It's a simple drag and drop meme into the game's directory, and it seems to have worked for some people. It didn't work for me, however. And in the end, I decided to buy the game again on GOG, putting myself in financial ruin for the sake of this channel, as they sell the complete edition. With compatibility settings on and the fix in the description applied, the game launched and loaded into the campaign without any problems. Or so I thought. You see, this is a 32-bit application, meaning that it cannot utilize more than 2 GB of RAM, so if you want to play this game maxed out but are experiencing memory crashes, you'll need another patch. Put the large address aware executable in your game's directory, run it and select wick.exe. After doing all of that, the game ran with no issues from beginning to end. And with that, finally, this video can properly begin. World in Conflict was created by a Swedish development company by the name of Massive Entertainment. The only other IP released by them before this time was the real-time strategy series Ground Control, the first entry of which came out in the year 2000, meaning that, in the grand scheme of things, Massive Entertainment hasn't been around for the same amount of time as some of the other big developers. I never played the Ground Control games, but looking at the gameplay of them on YouTube, I can really see the resemblance between the second game especially and the one they would go on to release in 2007. I think it's quite clear in the bottom half of the UI in particular. Both the minimap and the special commands on the right are pretty much the same as you would get in World in Conflict. I don't know if those games were any good myself, but if Steam reviews are anything to go by, I think there's at least a couple of people out there that enjoyed them. But even if they weren't any good, at the very least this series would have provided Massive with some sort of experience of working within the genre of real-time strategy before making World in Conflict. Unlike Ubisoft Shanghai in my last video, who had absolutely zero experience in this field before creating End War. Which, since I've mentioned the big boy Ubisoft now, I do have one correction I need to make from the last video. When you boot up World in Conflict, you're greeted by a Ubisoft splash screen. Now with most other games, that would give you a clear indication of who exactly published the title you're playing. The thing is that Massive Entertainment has jumped through publishers throughout the years as if it was a 10-year-old ADHD-riddled child swiping through TikTok videos. From Sierra Interactive to Vivendi Universal, which was actually a video game holding company that I guess outsourced publishing to other firms, I'm not exactly sure how that works, and somehow also Rebellion if you trust Steam. And it wasn't until the release of the Soviet Assault expansion after the base game of World in Conflict was already out that Massive was actually acquired by Ubisoft. Ultimately, this doesn't really affect the 2 videos in my series, as there are still good comparisons to be made nonetheless. Though a mistake is a mistake. I'll add this to my top 10 smelliest gamer moments. Surprisingly, and maybe even sadly, World in Conflict is Massive Entertainment's last RTS title to date. The next proper game they would go on to develop was The Division, 9 years after, which wasn't really my cup of tea. And they also had a small part in making Assassin's Creed Revelations and Far Cry 3 within that 9-year gap. Whether this focus away from real-time strategy was a decision made by Massive or the big evil publisher, I don't really know. But the idea of an alternate timeline where we could have had Relic, Eugen, and Massive Entertainment as the big 3 of RTS is exciting. Because, as we're about to find out, Massive Entertainment knew how to make a good RTS game. One thing that really stands out in World in Conflict for me is its presentation. These cinematically shot cutscenes are still some of the best I've ever seen in an RTS game. And even though the graphics are starting to show their age a little bit, I still think that the fact that they are all done in-engine is just such an impeccable flex that I can't help but admire them. This is an area that is often overlooked in other strategy games. They're usually not considered to be important enough to waste development time on, and you can look at the quality of presentation in End War from the last video as an example, though you don't have to look very far to find other games within this genre that don't really bother in that aspect. What is even crazier to me is that there were some other high-profile RTS games released before World in Conflict that tried making cinematic in-engine cutscenes but were less successful at it. If you ever replay the original Company of Heroes, it's striking how much the game engine struggles to chug along through even the first cutscene. That game was published by Sega, and yet, here comes World in Conflict, doing the exact same thing, running smooth as silk. Although there is one thing that needs to be mentioned. This first mission wasn't part of the original game. This first mission, cutscenes and all, along with 5 others, was added to the game in the Soviet Assault expansion. And I have to say that, at least this early on in the game, this expansion was a massive improvement. Because the base game started a little differently. For now, I'll just say that I much prefer how World in Conflict starts in its current complete form. We'll find out why that is in a little bit later in the video though. We start the first proper cutscene in the game following Major Lebechev on his way to meet with Colonel Orlovsky, who, as we find out, is a legend.
That's Colonel Orlovsky. He's a legend.
A little on the nose, but hey. If you want a movie-like experience, then this is pretty much as good as it gets in RTS games. Everything from how the scene is shot, to how the characters interact with each other, as well as the excellent score composed by Ola Strand, make these feel like you're watching a movie from the 80s. I especially like this first exchange between Lebechev and Orlovsky. There's some good initial tension and then gets subverted quite nicely through dialogue, even if it does feel a little like they're talking more to the audience than to each other.
Your command is the key to this whole grand endeavor, comrade. How could they send anyone but me?
Your sense of self-importance hasn't lessened, I see.
But I am very important, am I not? Or at least my dear old father-in-law is.
It's good to see you, old friends.
We learn that some sort of military operation is about to take place. It's not outright said what exactly is about to happen, though if you know anything about World in Conflict, you'll probably be able to figure out that we're literally about to start World War III by invading West Germany. So, how exactly did we get here? To find that out, we have to rewind a little bit to some exposition we get when we load into the first mission. In the winter of 1988, at the end of its economic decline, the Soviet Union asks for financial aid from the West. And it's in this first sentence that the story showed its first cracks. I swear this is about as autistic as this video is going to get, so hold on tight. What came to mind when I read this was the Kursk submarine disaster that took place in the year 2000, because I am just that cool. If you don't know what happened, the Russian nuclear submarine Kursk was involved in a Russian Navy exercise off of the coast of the Murmansk Oblast, not far from the border between Russia and Finland. The submarine suffered from an accidental detonation caused by one of its faulty torpedoes, which subsequently resulted in between 5 to 7 more torpedo warheads to also explode. All but 23 sailors were killed by the explosions, with the remaining survivors managing to find refuge in another compartment of the ship. What really cemented the Kursk disaster into infamy, and the reason for why I'm even mentioning it, was Russia's reluctance to accept aid from the West to help rescue the remaining survivors on board. Help was offered by members of NATO on the very same day that the accident took place, with the United States even offering to bring 2 deep submergence rescue vehicles perfectly suited for this sort of scenario. But, be it national pride, a way to save face and pretend like things were perfectly under control, or a continuous grudge towards the West, the Russians refused any help for 4 days. Russia would eventually accept British and Norwegian help on day 5, and those rescue attempts would go underway by day 7, by which time it was too late. A flash fire had occurred at some point during the course of the incident, starving all remaining oxygen on board the Kursk and killing the remaining crew. So the reason for why I included all of that in this video is to illustrate the general attitude held by the Russian government towards Western aid. Because if Russia is stubborn enough to refuse help for something that is comparatively as small as a submarine rescue mission due to its sense of pride, then imagine how they might feel about the idea of asking for what is likely billions in financial aid from these same countries, and you might start to see some problems. Let's also consider that the Kursk happened under the Russian Federation, whereas this game is dealing with the Soviet Union, a country that would have likely been even more against this type of aid to begin with. I have more things to say about this, including mentioning the big elephant in the room that was the inspiration behind the whole premise of World in Conflict, but there's a much better place later where we can properly explore that. Yes, I realize I'm saying that a lot, but if you looked at the length of this video and clicked on it expecting brevity, well, that's on you, pal. For now, we get to oversee a preliminary Spetsnaz strike on the west side of the wall. Meh. Maybe this cutscene was cooler in 2009, but the game definitely looks best when there's some proper lighting both in cinematics and when you're playing the actual levels. You can see that firsthand right after the cutscene ends. The tutorial Spetsnaz level looks pretty dull compared to the same exact map just moments later. It also doesn't help that this mission is pretty much impossible to fail unless you order your units directly out of the playable area. The American soldiers guarding this anti-air base are stormtrooper levels of incompetent, and there's a big deal made about this helicopter patrolling the perimeter of your 2 targets, which thankfully turns out to be piloted by fucking Grandpa Joe with cataracts and astigmatism to boot, the poor bastard. You can just right-click on your two objectives, wait for the timers to tick down on both, and your units will just automatically take care of the guards without any issue. Which is actually the complete opposite of how the rest of the combat is going to be in this game, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Don't get me wrong though, I think this is still a good addition to the game, because not only is it really short, it also teaches first-time players some fundamental game mechanics such as moving units onto objectives and using special abilities, and it does so in a more natural way than having to play the actual boot camp mission that's in the game. That's still available to play in the complete edition, by the way. It's kind of made redundant because the first mission does a good job at explaining pretty much everything you can do, but I suppose it's extra content either way. I do want to point something out quickly though, and I'm not just doing so to be pedantic. The fact that you're fighting nothing but American soldiers in the first mission is quite baffling. Yes, Americans were definitely stationed in West Germany. I can believe that they might have had anti-air batteries such as this one near the Iron Curtain, and it makes sense for them to be manned by American soldiers if that is the case. It would also make sense for at least some amount of the defending forces to be American units. After all, this is a scenario that has seen months of heightened political tension between the two sides, so it's entirely possible that the US could have sent more manpower over to help in case something happened. But the fact that the only forces you are fighting once the invasion begins are Americans isn't just weird because of the obvious reason that West Germany had an army of its own. The stranger reason is that European units already exist in the game, so you can't even blame this on rushed development time. It could be the case that the devs couldn't find a way to mix both NATO and American units on one side at the same time, because the multiple missions where you do get to control Western European units in the game, you can only do so exclusively. But then again, your AI teammates almost always control American units while you're controlling NATO ones, so I don't know, America's strong, I guess. Anyway, the explosives are planted successfully and the Spetsnaz operatives go to exfiltrate. Orlovsky says the team will find their way back to base in the coming days, which I thought was pretty funny considering they're only about 200 meters max from the wall. An extra line about maybe hunkering down and hiding or maybe going away to complete more objectives on their own could have been a cool little bit of extra content to make that line make more sense. For now though, we are introduced to Captain Malashenko in what is probably my favorite cutscene in the game.
I'm in a drive-thru a Burger King. Can I please get a Whopper Jr. with onion rings? Make it a meal so I can get a drink. No, I'm not finished.
Welcome back, Grisha. Oh, how was recruit training?
Boring.
Ha, but necessary, Comrade Sergeant. Those recruits will soon be needed. Товарищи! It's good to see you all here today. And it will be even better to see you soon breaking through that wall! Then we'll teach those NATO dogs how to fight! They thought they could bully us into submission! They thought we'd give way and fall! And today, we'll show them that the Red Army bows to no one! Today, we'll show them the might of the Soviet Union! Get your vehicle! We go to war!
It's just so perfectly camp, I love it.
What are you doing? You're not the thinker!
The assault on West Germany begins with a very impressive display of the game's destruction system. First by making you call in an artillery strike, which the game flashes on the top left of the screen serving as another tutorial, and this is immediately followed by a set piece where the Iron Curtain is demolished with planted explosives. World in Conflict was the first game I played that let you call in off-map assets such as artillery barrages, air-to-ground strafes, and massive carpet bombing runs, just to name a few. I remember thinking this was the coolest thing ever when I first played this game, and to this day, these explosion effects still look, sound, and feel fantastic. These shockwave effects are especially cool and make them feel like they have a lot more impact. In fact, in my opinion, the game is at its best when the only task it gives you is to just call in non-stop fire support, not having to worry about keeping your units alive, kind of like it does at the end of this first mission. Your screen will quickly fill up with nothing but fireballs and dust as you watch the ground progressively fill out with craters and vehicle wrecks. This, mixed in with the hordes of enemies the game tends to spawn during these sections, make this part of the game feel absolutely glorious. Once you capture the third objective in this mission, you are rewarded with some deployment points. Deploying units in World in Conflict is still unlike anything I've ever seen in any other RTS game. This is your unit deployment button at the top right of the screen. The value on the left is how many points you currently have to spend, while the right value shows your reserve points. When one of your units is killed, its total value will be added to the reserves, which will then slowly trickle into your spendable unit points over time. To spawn units, you first have to select a suitable drop zone on the map, which is represented by this green checkered pattern. After which the units you selected for deployment will be airdropped in by a massive transport plane with a cool looking flare show for added spice. While there are some criticisms I can make about this system, for now I will just say that this is still a very impressive way to call in units in a game. I like that there is always a lot going on in the airspaces of all these battles. It's very different from other RTS games released around this time. But I think it's time we moved on from the first mission in the game. And with that, we're going to shift things up a gear. The Russians successfully liberate the rest of Berlin. But even though you're constantly told throughout the game that the commies are proving to be incredible adversaries, they don't actually manage to capture that much territory if the loading screen expositions are anything to go by. Regardless, switching to the American side in what is now the second mission in the complete edition of the game, we are thrust forward in time by an unspecified number of months after the initial invasion of Western Europe. Here we learn that Seattle has been invaded, as in Seattle the city, in the mainland United States. How, you might ask? With cargo ships. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this, because this was a meme even back when the game first came out. And fucking rightfully so. Even if the United States had to send a lot of its fleet to help out with the war raging in Europe, how in the fuck are we meant to believe that a country with not only the biggest, most capable navy in the world, but also an air force that bases its entire doctrine around, wasn't able to detect what was likely dozens of suspicious cargo ships heading towards the west coast from Russia? You would think that the Pacific would be a big point of interest for the Americans, considering it's the shortest distance between the two countries. And well, the game does mention the navy. Barely.
The army was fighting in Europe and elsewhere, and our navy was supposed to protect us from an invasion. But they failed.
Yeah, no fucking shit. But even disregarding everything I just said, getting their units off of those cargo ships wouldn't be an easy task. It's not like your typical invasion vessel where you can just drop down a ramp and have all of your infantry and vehicles out and ready within a matter of minutes. You'd need crane operators to lift everything up from the deck and down onto the docks. Even if somehow every dock crane operator was somehow a Soviet mole, this would still take so much fucking time to do that none of this is even slightly believable, even if the Navy somehow managed to fuck up this hard. At some point someone would notice an entire battalion of Russians unloading tanks at the docks and make a little phone call. This is the problem with writing fiction based around the invasion of the United States, i.e. you probably shouldn't do it unless you're willing to create a backdrop for this setting that makes this seem even remotely possible. The film that inspired World in Conflict, Red Dawn, at the very least attempted to create some sort of alternate timeline in which America was a lot more vulnerable to a mainland attack. Red Dawn's version of the United States is left isolated after the disbandment of NATO as an example, and Mexico also becomes a communist state after a successful coup. It's not perfect, but at the very least, they did the bare minimum instead of just saying, "They failed." It's clear to me that Massive Entertainment just really wanted to make a game set during an invasion of America by the Soviet Union. And I mean, why wouldn't they? It's a pretty dope setting. But they didn't really care to put much thought into how they could make that happen in a believable way, which is a shame considering that there are times in this game where the writing isn't half bad. Though, granted, this is mostly best showcased in the expansion. So anyway, Seattle is invaded by the Soviets. And while I did just take the piss out of this dismissive line about the US Navy, if I'm feeling charitable, I could say that the intended effect of it was meant to be representative of the High Command's attitude towards this fact. Sort of like a, who cares how or why it happened, and we need to stop it. If only. We are introduced to Captain Bannon in what is very clearly meant to be a stressful and chaotic scene, which in my opinion ends up being unintentionally comedic. If this was 2018, he'd be the crazy ass in the group. He manages to find his way to the player character, Parker, who always has his back turned towards the camera for some reason. There's a player character on the Russian side of the story as well, by the way. His name is Romanov, and you never get to see his face either. Coincidence? Bannon's whole deal is that he's a fuck-up, and a complete tsundere towards Parker.
Not a minute too soon, Parker! Your slowness almost cost me another tank!
And since there are literally no other officers around, Bannon takes charge of the National Guard forces and immediately sends a scout helicopter away to its demise.
We lost 4 choppers down there already! It's a death sentence! So is treason, Lieutenant.
Yes, sir. Go in there now. Red Eye out. My God, it's the entire Red Army down there. They got the whole harbor. We have to pull out now. Retreat, sir, retreat. Ah!
Red Eye 4! Come in! God damn it!
You know what? I take the whole cargo ship thing back. Apparently every single pilot in the US military has 20 to 10 million vision. No wonder no one spotted those Russians. It's basically decided that nothing can be done at this point. The Russians have amassed too great of a force at the docks, and the best thing to do is simply retreat out of Seattle and save as many citizens as possible. Because the Soviets aren't fucking around, you see. There's a football stadium filled with civvies taking shelter, and they're about to blow that shit up, boy! It becomes your mission to delay this from happening until all of the civilians are evacuated, which of course you manage to do. It's a primary objective after all. The mission is concluded with the remaining National Guard forces successfully retreating out of the city, though not before being contacted by Colonel Sawyer, a character of whom it is implied both Bannon and Parker have some sort of history.
This is Eagle 6. Captain Bannon, is that you?
Colonel Sawyer? How the hell?
No time, Captain. Bring what forces you have and meet me by the I-90 bridge. You got that?
Sir,
A simple yes will suffice, Bannon.
Yes, sir, we'll be there. Bannon out.
Time for us to take another call. Hi, you're on the air.
They're coming from the skies, man!
If you would, just calm down.
This can't be happening. This is America. Come on, damn it. Aren't you listening? These are what it seems like to look up in the sky.
The third mission is an important one, because by now you'll have experienced enough of this game's combat to notice some of its, I guess, quirks. But before I mention those, let's give World in Conflict some credit where it's due. The side that you engage vehicles from actually matters. Frontal armor is much better at negating damage, which was refreshing having only just made a video about End War. There's a large variety of different unit types, including heavy, medium and light tanks, which actually just means new tank, old tank and older tank in most cases, though this simplification makes sense gameplay-wise and I don't really mind it. Infantry is quite fun to use in this game. In large numbers they're pretty much going to be able to handle anything in their way, especially if hiding in forests and buildings. It's cool to see things like infantry actually peeking out of buildings and shooting at things. It's a small thing that adds to the spectacle of the game, and I wish Eugen would start doing the same. Units' special abilities are well implemented for the most part. It's nice that if I come across a heavy tank with an APC that I have at least some way of fighting back and dealing damage. Imagine if instead, every time you ran across a T-80 tank with anything other than another heavy tank or another vehicle specifically designed to counter it and just got fucked instantly. Wink wink. It's a nice way of making all of your units more viable on the battlefield if used correctly, though I will say that spamming abilities when you have a lot of the same unit types can feel a little cheap, sort of like having a free delete button. Off-map assets feel very powerful, and the game often gives you more than enough points and enemies to use them to your heart's content. There's an excellent variety of them as well, and again, I like how much use the airspace in this game gets with all the different aircraft-based support. All of this is rounded off with most of the maps that the campaign takes place in being quite large. Not as large as I've seen in some other games, but they're big enough and built in a way that allows you to take objectives from many different angles. But there are two main aspects of this combat system that drive me up the fucking wall a little bit, and I'm surprised that I didn't recognize them back when I first played World in Conflict, considering how clearly flawed they seem now. Let's talk about micromanaging. It can be good to an extent. There is a fine balance of micromanaging that has to be found in all RTS games. A balance that falls somewhere between your units not being able to wipe their own asses without the player's input, and then being so independent that it feels more like you're watching drone footage. World in Conflict falls into the former half of this spectrum. So let's say you have a line of tanks defending an objective from a horde of enemies, not unlike what the game already does. It is incredibly common to either see your tanks shooting at some random, non-threatening unit miles away in the distance, or instead shooting at a soft target like a jeep in the completely opposite direction and pointing their ass straight towards an enemy heavy tank in the process. It actually feels like the AI sometimes tries to prioritize lighter, more squishy targets on purpose, because why should your heavy tank waste rounds on an enemy heavy tank if it can just shoot a fucking jeep and still get a kill. The second point started to get incredibly tiring the further I got into the game. Armored units try to face their front armor to whichever enemy they are engaging, but only when you tell them to attack a unit by right-clicking on them. Otherwise, they don't really seem to consider whether or not the way they are facing is leaving them open to more damage from other enemies within range. Telling your units what to engage is a bit of a pain in the ass as well, because of the point I made earlier. If I right-click on one unit within a tiny group of many, I would expect that after killing this unit, my tank would then automatically try and engage the ones right next to it. Instead, it will try to dome some random fucker across the map unless you sit there watching and manually selecting a new enemy every single time. And this is especially egregious when attacking infantry. From what I can tell, every single person in an infantry unit is treated by the AI as its own separate entity. This means that if you use a tank and right-click on a squad of infantry, as soon as it kills one guy, your TC just goes, "Job's done," and starts engaging some other unit in the complete opposite direction. The only real way to make sure that your tanks keep engaging infantry units is to spam-click them until they're all dead, which gets very tedious, especially if you're controlling a lot of different units at the same time. Time to kill can be a bit of an issue sometimes. World in Conflict is definitely more of a classic style RTS in that sense. I'm playing this game on normal difficulty in the footage you're seeing, and even so, enemies tend to be quite bullet spongy. And since the only thing that the harder difficulties in the game do is give enemies more hit points, I really don't see much of a reason to play on anything higher than hard if you enjoy absolutely anything about life. Here's a bonus criticism that is gameplay related. The designers of these campaign missions were big fans of the show don't tell meme. Your gameplay is often interrupted and control of the camera is taken away from you when it's time to show you your next objective. This happens a lot, and it's gotten in my way of trying to do something in the game at times. There's this one example in the Battle of Pine Valley mission, which, by the way, is the mission I always remembered the most when thinking about World in Conflict for whatever reason. I may have failed it a lot or something back in the day, playing on a laptop and all that. Colonel Sawyer tells you that you can drop in a free M1 Abrams tank after you complete one of your main objectives.
You move fast, Parker. I'm detailing an M1 tank to you. Put it to good use.
I heard that shit and immediately went to buy it, only to be interrupted and have my hands held by his cold, grubby paws yet again. Most of these are completely unnecessary, and I think that an objective marker that flashed on the screen or on the minimap for a few seconds would suffice. This sort of thing isn't just a World in Conflict problem, though. A lot of mainstream games around this time were guilty of over-explaining objectives to the player. After all, this was around the time where gaming was starting to become a lot more popular. We have the Xbox 360 and games like Call of Duty 4 to thank for that. But with this new stream of casual players, I think a lot of game devs became hyper-conscious of trying to make their games accessible to as many people as possible. And as a result, we had many years worth of games that treated their players like children. Here's what you have to do to proceed. Let me tell you about it. Actually, no, I'll show you specifically what you have to do, in case you're not listening. I'm just glad that we've managed to somewhat move back to some sort of happy medium recently. The whole objective of the third mission, Reunion, is to protect a bridge in the outskirts of Seattle, allowing its population to flee the city. Meanwhile, we find out that the Russians are not only loading civilians in the neighboring houses into school buses to be shipped off to God knows where, I just hope it's not the Gulag. But it just so happens that the house of a US Army general is also located in this neighborhood, and the Russians are already there. But oh no, the general's family is still hiding out in the house.
Come in, Parker. Russian infantry has been sighted near a house belonging to General Levinson. I just talked to him. His family is still there, and they must be evacuated before it's too late. I wonder where those bastards got his address.
Should have used today's sponsor. You save the president's daughter. Oh, wait. You save the general's family, and we are introduced to these two characters for the very first time. Characters so important that you may not even know their names unless you pay very close attention. This is Anton, by the way, and this is Mike. Don't feel too bad if you didn't know that. They are somewhat distinct from your average GI by the fact that one of them has a troll doll looking ass thing on his chest, and the other one has a portable CD player.
This, my friend, is a portable CD player.
These are their character motives. Anton is Hispanic and has a daughter.
Stow him away, cabron.
And Mike's whole arc is about the fact that he cannot find any batteries for his copyright claim machine. I am not looking forward to the last cutscene in this video.
I'd show you, but the batteries are dead. I wish I could find some new ones.
Colonel Sawyer turns up at the crime scene and decides it's time to fuck some shit up, though not before teasing this conflict between himself and Bannon.
Lieutenant Parker, Good to see you alive. And Captain Bannon, seems I can't get rid of you.
Seems that way, Colonel.
Well, from what I gathered, you did a decent job in organizing the retreat, but I'm prepared to let bygones be bygones.
I'm going to talk more about and compare the writing between the original campaign and Soviet assaults soon. Bet you didn't think that was what you were getting into when you clicked on this video, but I think I have some good points to bring up about it, and I hope you're at least enjoying the ride. Type look here, look listen in the comments if you made it this far. For now, once all of the civilians make it across, it is decided that the bridge is to be destroyed, and this next player objective that we get on the other side was kind of annoying. Pretty much every campaign mission in the game comes with optional secondary objectives. These can range from anything from capturing an additional zone on the map, to killing a specific unit, to even repairing a broken down vehicle. Pretty much all of them are worth doing, because beyond just having the bragging rights of 100% completing a level, they also tend to make your life a little bit easier. The first secondary objective of this third mission is a perfect example of this. You are tasked with repairing 3 AA vehicles that aren't even defended by any enemies. Just send out a Humvee and repair all 3 of them without any problems. Doing so results in your next main objective becoming a lot easier to deal with, as the AA vehicles you just repaired stop a squadron of helicopters from coming in to defend it. This is probably as useful and as easy as these secondary objectives get, though anytime you see them, they're pretty much always worth doing. But even with this help from having completed the secondary objective, this next zone was still annoying to take for one reason. The game likes to spawn enemies in places that don't make sense. With the way that this map is laid out, it would make sense for enemies to come at you from any of these directions, except they don't. There were numerous times where random armored vehicles seemingly spawned out of thin air and started blasting me from the back. In fact, I was so confident that they were going to come at me from anywhere else but behind, because what the fuck, that's where my spawn is pretty much, that the AA I left there got fucking murked without me knowing, except for when I heard Stephen Hawking say, "You lost a unit." This sort of stuff happens too often. There was an instance of vehicles spawning on my screen in the first invasion mission that I wasn't going to mention. I can tolerate enemies not existing until you get close enough to an objective. It's probably how they got this engine to run so smooth with the amount of things happening all at once. But time and time again throughout the entire campaign, I've had enemy units rolling up to me from places I've either been to or even spawned in for no good reason whatsoever, and it ruins any semblance of tactics or strategy for me. There are some missions where this actually works. The Battle of Pine Valley is supposed to be a desperate defense from all angles towards the end, so enemies spawning at you and coming from every angle works. But then there is others where you have a sense of there being some sort of front line that you're a part of, and yet units just appear behind you out of nowhere. It just feels kind of cheap. Alas, the I-90 bridge is blown up, and as the National Guard continues its retreat, our perspective shifts again to the Russian side. I think it's time to talk about the writing. There's just one quick thing I have to say before we get properly stuck in. I'm going to be showing a lot of cutscenes moving forward, and I usually would have liked to have subtitles to be running so that everyone can find it easier to follow what is being said. World in Conflict is a little bit weird about this, though. I have subtitles enabled in the settings, though they seemingly show up whenever they feel like it. Hence why sometimes you'll see subtitles under cutscenes, and sometimes you won't. I hope they're easy enough to follow regardless.
My love, I hope this letter finds you well. In my heart, I feel I will know if something happens to you. It is so hard to face the day without you by my side.
My dearest Natasha, I am writing this sitting on a tractor, just like those we have on the kolkhozes back home. They are not so different from us, these Americans.
They have begun working triple shifts at the factory. I am glad that Inessa is not working nights. Many factories have been bombed, and I fear she...
Though I am a little worried about Kolya. He is very hard on the men, and when I tried to talk to him, he just shrugged it off. I will have to make it clear that he is under my command.
I think about all the boys over there whose mothers cannot sleep for worry. Those serving with you must be the lucky ones, Velocha, for I know that you care deeply for them.
I will be home soon enough. Until then, know that I love you. Your Vladimir.
I've alluded to the fact that I think the writing in Soviet Assault is much better than the original game, and before I get into the reasons for why that is, it actually makes perfect sense why from a purely practical perspective. The original game took about 3 years to develop, give or take. It came out with 14 campaign missions, all with numerous cutscenes in each, and the entire concept for the game obviously still had to be created. Soviet Assault, on the other hand, was developed within around a year and a half. It added 6 missions to a game that already had all of its groundwork laid out, meaning that they could focus a lot more on the details of this new story perspective they wanted to make. I think that this could partly explain this jump in quality in both the technical look of the Soviet Assault cutscenes, as well as how the general story around it is written. And now all that is left is to get into the nitty-gritty. I think it kind of goes without saying, but there are going to be some major spoilers from this point on. I think that one of the things that really stand out between the two sides are the characters, specifically their motivations and what the writers were trying to convey through them. Orlovsky, his role in the war, as well as his relationship with his nephew Malashenko, is probably the most intriguing part of the World in Conflict story, and I only truly found myself paying attention whenever he was on screen or narrating. We learned earlier that Orlovsky is a legend. And that's true. It's not entirely made clear, though it's possible that he had a part in the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But even if that isn't true, his numerous victories across Europe and later America should show not only his adept skills at leading his men, but also his devotion to his country. Malashenko, for all intents and purposes, is this blind loyalty to the USSR personified, a kind of Soviet Übermensch. He will do what is necessary to fulfill the needs of what he believes the country needs from him, without question, even if the means through which he goes about them are questionable at best. The motivations of Orlovsky are much different, however. He is of course loyal to the cause to some extent. I don't think he would have been able to be where he is now, in command of thousands of Russian soldiers, if he wasn't. But his motivations for winning these battles come from somewhere different. From the first mission in the game, we get the sense that he has mixed feelings about the invasion, stating outright that he hopes the war doesn't last long.
A few more like him, and this war will be over in a week.
I hope you are right, Valery Fedorovich. I really do.
There are numerous reasons for this that I have inferred myself. The most obvious one is that he cares for the men under his command, and doesn't want to inflict too much unnecessary suffering on both them and their families. But I think that there is an element of sympathy towards the enemy as well. A quick war would likely mean less casualties on both sides, and since you're trying to capture territory, it probably helps if you kill as little of the fathers, brothers, and nephews of the people you are going to subjugate as possible.
Valery, no. They hate us enough already. We have the location of their camp. That's where we'll strike.
You don't believe in this, do you? You don't think we belong here?
Do you?
Now, a question that someone might ask is, if he doesn't believe in this invasion, then why is he even here? The answer to this is never outright said, though you can take a pretty good guess based on what the game does tell us. Orlovsky cares about his men. He wants them to come home in one piece, and he is very good at what he does. It's likely that he believes that if it isn't him in command, then who will it be? If his men were instead left in command of Malashenko, left to his brash decision-making, then maybe staying to lead his men is the better outcome for everyone. The refreshing thing about Orlovsky is that he is the exact opposite of how most enemies, Russians especially, have typically been portrayed in games around the time Soviet Assault was released. You don't have to look far for examples of this. Call of Duty is a prime suspect, even recently, of portraying the Russians as these completely evil psychopaths that murder and torture without any hesitation. But even the original World in Conflict campaign in itself is guilty of this, showing Russians indiscriminately shooting at buildings filled with civilians in the first Seattle mission. Insert more Ukrainian memes here. Later on, where the tides of the war change, Orlovsky isn't naive to the futility of his efforts in America, unlike his nephew, one of the men under his command for whom he cares deeply for, making his betrayal, which takes place towards the end, even more effective, even if it wasn't entirely unpredictable. One of the best things that the Soviet assault campaign does is in the loading screen cinematics. These are almost always predicated by what is essentially Soviet propaganda. An example of it might be something like, "Our glorious comrades have inflicted yet another crushing defeat upon the American cowards on their own soil." After a few slides, these always fade out to Orlovsky's point of view, where, especially towards the end, he provides a much truer version of what is actually happening. It's almost darkly comedic in a way, and it's probably one of my favorite aspects of this game.
But he emphasized that there is no doubt that we are winning this war, and that the end is in sight.
It was a rout. Our scattered forces headed for Seattle, and the relief we hoped we would find there.
Now, contrast all of what I just said to the writing in the American campaign, and you will quickly see that there is a lot less nuance there. I think that partly this is intentional. It has to do with the fact that the Americans are the defenders in World in Conflict. You tend to question a lot less about your role in the war if your entire country and people are at stake, so I can't really blame the writing in that aspect. What is really apparent to me, though, is the lack of any well-written characters. The only thing the game has going for it so far is this feud between Bannon and Sawyer, the reasons behind which haven't been explained up until now, though they're not that interesting when they eventually are. Pretty much all of the cast on the American side are just stereotypical war movie characters. The meme where I put Bannon on the "which one are you" meme isn't actually that far off of how much real effort it would take to categorize every other character. Sawyer's a veteran commander. He's a badass that doesn't flinch at the meager artillery shells that land well within permanent hearing damage range of him at the start of the Battle of Pine Valley. Bannon's the cocky, possibly sarcastic one, and probably the one with the worst carpal tunnel syndrome with how much he wanks himself off constantly. And Webb is hardly even worth mentioning, hence why this is the first time I've even acknowledged him. I've been mulling over what I think about the two different campaigns in the game, and how the story is told in each of them, and what I finally came up with is this. In the original American story, the purpose of the cutscene seems to me to be for the purpose of setting a scene for your missions. Here's what's happening, here are your objectives. Go get those commie sons of bitches, my mutie cutie. Whereas in the Soviet assault campaign, it often feels like the line is much more blurred, if not entirely in the opposite direction. It often feels like the missions and the story have a much stronger connection. And look, maybe this ultimately doesn't matter. After all, I think RTS players are used to not relying on good writing as a motivator for playing these games at this point. But I think that good writing in games deserves to be seen and talked about, just as bad writing in any game deserves to be shit on. I mean, if you put absolute trash out there into the world, you only have yourself to blame. And to that first point, I think there's a lot to praise World in Conflict for when it comes to this. Even the original campaign was already so ahead of most other strategy games out there, but the drastic curve in quality that it achieved with its expansion is especially worthy of praise. I can't say that I remember what happens at the end of Company of Heroes, I don't know, they probably win the war or something. But I do remember the heights that World in Conflict achieved, and it had the potential to buck the trend of RTS games putting the absolute minimum effort into their writing. And it's a shame that we'll probably never see a World in Conflict 2 to see how massive entertainment could have outdone themselves. I haven't even mentioned the nukes yet, oh god. But we'll get to that. Because you may have noticed that we barely only just touched upon the 4th mission out of the total 20 in the game. Meaning that we have some catching up to do. Whereas in the first Soviet assault mission we witnessed the initial invasion of Western Europe, the second, or 4th overall mission, skips ahead to roughly the same time period as the American campaign. With the invasion of Washington well underway, Orlovsky is tasked with subduing American resistance groups in the rural areas of the state. Lebechev, Malashenko, and of course the player insert, Romanov, remain under his command. The Russians managed to capture a strategically important bridge necessary for their continuing advance onwards away from the city, though it becomes more and more clear to Orlovsky throughout the course of the battle, as well as later on, that the extreme resolve of both the American military as well as its citizens will basically make holding any territory in the country impossible in the long run. This is also the first mission where Malashenko starts to show his distrust towards his uncle, fighting him over simple orders and nagging about reinforcements where there are none possible. The Russians are already spread thin as it is due to this unexpected resistance from the Americans, and Malashenko is too blinded by his ideal version of this incredible Red Army to be able to see that. He ends up doing as Orlovsky asked in the end, thanks to which the mission resolves in the Russians' favor, proving again that the old man knows what he is doing. Despite their hardships, the Soviets continue to push forward with the Americans on the run. Sawyer's battle group, with Parker, Bannon and Webb, get caught out and surrounded around the small town of Pine Valley. They make a desperate attempt to hold out as they await the arrival of the USS Missouri, which thankfully makes it there just in time to provide support. Is that fucking battleship? Aye, so I was just getting ready to start talking absolute shit about how most battleships were decommissioned a little after World War II, when I realized that the actual USS Missouri was recommissioned between 1986 and 1992, meaning that since the game is set in the year 1990, this actually isn't that unreasonable. It really says something about the games industry when you're surprised at the fact that a writer somewhere actually did some research. Still kind of weird that a big-ass battleship was able to get here without any problems, considering the amount of damage the Soviets were apparently able to deal to the US Navy in Europe. Some destroyer escorts would have been a nice touch, seeing how one well-placed anti-ship missile could have had the potential of completely putting everyone's efforts in jeopardy. There is something to be said about the Pine Valley mission. It's definitely one where the difficulty increases a little bit if you're not careful. It's still one I look back on fondly because of this. There are plenty of buildings for both troops to hide in and for vehicles to hide behind, so a new player might find themselves losing a lot more units than in previous missions. Though there is one thing that I noticed while replaying it for this video that really rubbed me the wrong way, and there I even alt-tabbed to type it out in my notes while playing. I already mentioned that the game takes away your control of the camera way too often, but not only does this happen like twice as much in the battle for Pine Valley, there are also a lot of cutscenes. 3 of them not including the one that plays at the start. The last 2 played within just 90 seconds of each other, and one of them was completely fucking pointless. Like, I know we're still waiting for the Missouri to arrive, you don't have to show Sawyer on the radio asking about when the Missouri is going to arrive. The battleship effectively turns the tide of the battle, allowing the player to call in its devastating bombardments for free in yet another display of the strength that is this game's support and destruction systems. After the events at Pine Valley, the Soviet army ceased its attacks for some time, opting instead for securing the ground they managed to capture. A few weeks before Christmas, however, the attacks resumed, and the next objective that the Russians set their sights on is Fort Teller. This is a very important strategic point for the Americans, though not for the reasons I remembered it for. Because Fort Teller actually holds the answer to a question which I'm sure at least someone watching this video right now may have been wondering why I haven't posed yet. That being, where the fuck are the nukes? After all, these are 2 superpowers at war with each other, and the nuclear question hasn't once been hinted at throughout the course of the game. And the loading screen cinematic does provide us with some answers.
Several regiments attacked east up into the Cascade Range, and it soon became apparent that their objective was Fort Teller, the headquarters for the Strategic Defense Initiative, or as the public popularly dubbed it, the Star Wars Project. What we knew, and they didn't, was that the project was a bust. If the Russians reached the base, they'd realize the whole thing was basically a scam, that we had nothing to stop their nuclear missiles from striking our cities and military bases. We couldn't let them figure that out, so we moved east as well, taking the fight into the mountains and trying to delay the Russians, while Colonel Wilkins and his people at Fort Teller dug in as hard as they could.
So the reason for why World in Conflict isn't a spiritual RTS successor to Fallout is that the Russians thought that sending nuclear missiles at the United States would have been pointless, believing the Americans had the capability to shoot them all down anyway. And for the most part, I think this is a good explanation. Like, hear me out, I swear. Had the Star Wars project been successful in the game's universe, I would have some big questions about why the US isn't sending out nukes towards the USSR like it's going out of style. But the fact that the project was a bust is an important detail. Let's say that in this universe, the US did decide to nuke Russia. Because imagine you're the Soviet premier for a second. You've just learned that there are hundreds of ICBMs headed directly for every major city in the country. Now, I don't know about you, but even with the inaccurate knowledge that the US had this secret Star Wars project, I would still choose to retaliate. Just in case. And in this case, that would be the right call for the Soviets, and a dreadfully wrong one for the US. Hence why no nukes have been lobbed at this point in the campaign, and why Fort Teller, the supposed birthplace of this Star Wars legend, is so important to defend. I really didn't think I was going to be sitting here defending the reasons the game gives for the lack of use of nuclear weapons, and yet, here we are. I surprise even myself sometimes. This explanation does have some flaws, however, because if we flip the perspectives back to the Russians, then these attacks on not only Europe but the United States also is a very fucking ballsy move, considering that, as far as the Soviets knew, the US could have just nuked them at any point without any fear of being bombed themselves. Though seeing how the Soviets attacked out of desperation in the first place, as flawed as those reasons were as I explained earlier in the video, it's still somewhat believable that they would have taken their chances like this, even if only slightly. But hey, is better than some games. So in Mission 6, we do as Sawyer said, trying to delay the Russians at a river crossing in the mountains to buy time for the forces in Fort Teller to dig in and defend. Webb advises us that the forests around the water are perfect for hiding infantry, urging us to use them for a tactical advantage against the enemies. And you can completely ignore this advice. I, in fact, found this level to be much harder if you use infantry like the game suggests. The terrain here is uneven, meaning that the infantry finds it hard to shoot at anything without getting close enough to gatting distance, and there isn't enough cover around the actual objectives to stop your units from getting shredded by the numerous different armored vehicles that the Russians send towards you. And that's all before you even try to capture the objectives themselves. It's especially bad around this objective on the right, at least the other one has a house you can hide them in. Deploying as many light tanks as I could afford yielded a much better outcome. Once the first couple objectives are captured, Webb moves his own units in to defend them, while you are tasked with capturing a bridge on the far left side. This bridge is to be destroyed for the purposes of delaying the Russian advance, though that is delayed as we learn that Bannon and his company are caught out on the other side.
Good job, Parker. We'll wait a little while longer, but if Bannon isn't here soon, we'll blow the bridge.
He, of course, arrives just in time to get across, helping destroy a sudden surge of enemies storming our objective.
Eagle 6, this is Bannon! Don't blow the bridge yet! We're half a click out and coming up on the rear of several Soviet tanks! Engaging now!
Belay that order.
One of the things that happens during the course of this mission is that a snowstorm appears, which grounds the air support on both sides, including the reinforcements for the player. I mentioned earlier that I had some criticisms of the reinforcement mechanic in the game, and this is one of the few times throughout the course of the campaign where its use is limited. In theory, this is a good change. It often seems to me like your reinforcement points regenerate far too quickly, making any losses you sustain feel pretty inconsequential. There is a veterancy mechanic, where the longer a unit stays alive and the more kills it earns, the better it becomes. But this isn't to a point where it really makes that much of a difference, at least in my experience. This means that often, when your units inevitably lose HP, it's sometimes faster to just send them out to their death and call in replacements, than it would be to move them out of direct fire to send a jeep out and repair them. Having your ability to deploy new units taken away from you or limited to a certain total number of available units, like what happens in the next mission, is a pretty decent way of making you take better care of them. It also reinforces the idea that you are a desperate defender, or attacker in the case of the Soviets. After all, a lot of the game's story focuses around the fact that there are not enough units on either side to fight effectively. I did say in theory though, because the game gives you ample warning about the fact that this ability is about to be taken away from you, and it does so during a calm section in the battle, meaning that it doesn't really cause that many problems. I think that the total limited units mechanic that appears in the next mission is ultimately the better option. Though my main critique with reinforcements, or rather something I would have liked to see in a sequel or a spiritual successor, would have been a change to where different types of units can be spawned in. I know that this isn't meant to be a realistic game, I get that completely, but heavy tanks like the Abrams or the T-80 shouldn't be dropped in like this. I think the game could have done something more. It would have been cool to see a system where, for heavy vehicles, which are probably the most effective units in the game, you were only allowed to spawn them from a predetermined spawn point. Think of something like the spawning system in Wargame. You would have to account for the fact that, once these devastating units were called in, you would then have to make them travel to wherever you needed them from the edge of the map. Whereas certain types of troops, light tanks and other smaller units, could have been dropped in, maybe expanding the available drop zones to accommodate this change. I actually wonder how the game would handle itself if players were allowed to drop lighter units anywhere on the map whilst making transport planes vulnerable to AA. That may be a case of something that sounds cool but wouldn't really work with this game in particular, but I kind of like the idea of it anyway. But for a first incarnation of this system that's in the game right now, it's alright. It's just a shame that we'll never see it iterated upon. The next mission, Insurgents, switches back to the Russian perspective again. I've already shown snippets of it while talking about the writing. It's the one where Orlovsky and Lebechev hold their first confrontation about their presence in America. Orlovsky's battle group is seen recovering from a recent attack by an American resistance group, which left around 40 Soviet soldiers dead. Irritated by these constant losses to civilians, the solution seems simple, at least to Malashenko. In the loading screen cinematic before this mission, where he is interviewed by Lebechev, he suggests that every ambush should be answered with the the execution of 10 random civilians, a suggestion which is rightfully shunned by his uncle, because, as I've pointed out many times by now, Orlovsky isn't stupid. He knows that these types of draconian measures would almost definitely result in even more ambushes, and more Russian deaths as a result.
His idea has some merit.
I will not be privy to wholesale slaughter of civilians just so he can satiate his need for revenge.
It might work, though.
Valery, no. They hate us enough already.
I really like the dynamic between Orlovsky and Lebedev. My Soviet officer ranking knowledge isn't exactly up to snuff, I must say, but I think that Orlovsky outranks Lebedev by at least one level. However, they're never seen formally showing respect to each other as you might expect. The respect that they do show to each other is arguably much stronger than that, through their friendship and their trust towards each other to be able to speak somewhat freely. Having said that though, it's clear that Lebedev is still having to push Orlovsky for answers. It could be due to an element of baseline distrust that seemed to have plagued the Red Army since its inception, where anything seen as even remotely close to being disloyal, or an act of cowardice, could have landed you straight in a desk job on the very, very best of days. The main objective of this mission is an attack on a guerrilla base of operations, where we are tasked with capturing one of the main resistance leaders operating in the area. Before that though, there are a few other bases that you must clear out using a limited number of reinforcements. This mission quickly became one of my favorites because of this fact. Even though the game is quite generous with how many reinforcements you do get, it was still nice to have to think about what approaches to the objectives could provide the most cover for my infantry. This is somewhat negated after the first objective though, as the game allows you to call in VDV paratroopers without any hard capacity limit. As long as you have enough support points, you can call on them all you want. The mission concludes with another huge battle around the final base, where the resistance leader is located. You have to protect the base as you wait for a helicopter to arrive to escort him away. As the mission concludes, we learn that Malashenko has gone missing. I wonder what he's up to.
Didn't you hear me? They came and fired!
But comrade captain, the colonel forbade us.
Look at the idea! Next time your people will think twice before attacking us.
What is the meaning of this? Get them out of here. Explain yourself, Captain.
They were harboring weapons and food for the insurgents.
I gave explicit orders that there should be no firing squads.
They were aiding the enemy.
That is irrelevant, Captain. You do not have the right to disobey my orders.
But what if your orders are wrong?
If you act without my consent again, I will have you court-martialed and sent home in shame. Is that understood? Is that understood, Nikolai?
No, Colonel. It's not.
What? You think I'm wrong?
It does not matter what I think, does it, Vladimir Vasilievich? For good or ill, you have chosen your course.
But have you chosen yours, Valery? Sooner or later you will have to.
We're back with the Americans in the next mission, protecting a town just in the outskirts of Fort Teller. I'm going to play the full cutscene that precedes this mission, and hopefully you can see why I find the original campaign so much more underwhelming compared to what we just witnessed moments ago.
This will be our final stand. We have to stop Ivan from reaching Fort Teller.
What do we got in terms of support?
The Air Force will be flying CAS missions around the clock, but don't count on them to turn the tide. I'm not gonna lie to you, the Russians will throw everything they have at us, and we have to hold no matter what.
We'll hold, Colonel.
We've come a long way, gentlemen, and I trust that you will do what is needed when the time comes.
Colonel Sawyer, sir, the Russians have reached the outer perimeter.
And so it begins. Get to your units. We'll teach Ivan the price of invading our homeland.
In the loading screen, Sawyer tells us that Bannon has gone unusually quiet. And we can see that for ourselves in the cutscene that follows. The problem with this is that it's coming out of nowhere. There's nothing that has happened up to this point to warrant this sudden behavioral change. And I can't help but feel that the only reason for why this is happening is so that we feel at least a little bad for him when he chooses to sacrifice himself at the end of this mission. It's kind of like the writers realized that the player wouldn't really feel too bad for him if he's been nothing but an ass this entire time. So they chose to mellow him out a little so that we actually feel something for when this happens later. The Americans are able to defend against numerous Russian attacks in the town of Cascade Falls, though after hours of brutal fighting, with the enemy persevering even after Sawyer calls in a devastating bombardment wiping out hundreds of Soviet troops, he is given the order to call in a tactical nuclear strike.
I have great news. Our scouts report that Ivan is moving at least 3 fresh armored battalions into the area. We cannot hold against that many.
But we can't fall back! We'll lose everything!
You're right, Captain. I've been authorized to call in a tactical nuclear strike on the Soviet formations.
A nuclear strike, sir?
Roger that, Webb. It should break them once and for all. It's our only remaining option. We regroup at the high school, call in the strike, and get the hell out of the blast area.
Fort Teller cannot fall into Soviet hands after all, leaving the American High Command with very few options. Things aren't that simple though. If all American units turn back and flee across the bridge to safety, then the Russians would figure out that something bad is about to happen. Someone needs to stay behind to distract them.
Right, but whoever stays behind will be in the blast zone. It's a suicide mission. I've talked to the men, sir. We'll do it.
Are you sure, Bannon? I cannot order you to do this.
I understand, sir. We'll do it.
And so it is decided. It didn't take him very long to offer himself and his men up, so I'm sure there's a lot of very confused US soldiers in the town right now going, "He said what?" The remaining companies, including Parker, Webb, and Sawyer, all evacuate, and we get this final exchange between Sawyer and Bannon.
Understood, Captain. I appreciate what you're doing.
Sir, I just want to say I'm sorry.
No need, Captain. I'm humbled to have served with you.
Thank you, sir. Bannon out.
Well, rest in peace, Bannon. I'm sure he's dead for good. He is? Oh. Damn. Okay, so this Sawyer v Bannon feud has been brought up so many times now that surely we're going to find out what the hell happened between them soon, right? Oh well, it just so turns out that mission number 9, Seeing the Elephant, goes back in time to not long after the initial invasion began, around 4 months ago from where we just left off. We see Colonel Sawyer being called back into active duty from retirement. A stalemate between the two warring sides, coupled with there not being enough capable commanders to lead NATO effectively, forced the Americans to look to their retired veterans for help. Sawyer brings up the reasons for why he was relieved from his previous duties in the army, which is casually shrugged off.
You do know why I was discharged, don't you?
Well, all has been forgiven, Colonel.
I didn't ask for your goddamn forgiveness. You people got us into this mess in the first place. And now you're standing there with your pants down wondering what to do.
I'm sure we'll find out about it later, though. Right? Sawyer is stationed in the south of France, where the Soviets had just managed to stage a successful beach landing thanks to a major naval victory in the Mediterranean. He is, of course, joined by the one and only Captain Bannon, as well as Lieutenant Parker. Bannon shows up late to a briefing, and so the adversity begins.
Charlie Company is waiting for you by a farm just beyond this patch of forest. You can actually see it from here.
Yeah,
Get over there now. We're moving into the attack within the hour.
Yes, sir.
Very eager. He'll be dead by dinner.
We'll see. Where were we, Commandant? You lost one of your officers?
Yes, a sous-lieutenant. The fool stepped on a mine.
Parker can handle that command.
You want your lieutenant to lead my men? But that is unheard of.
Do you doubt the competence of my officers, Commandant?
Vous arrogants américains, vous pensez que vous dirigez le monde comme il vous plaît? Ah, c'est pas possible, incroyable.
Nous avons une guerre à gagner et je vais faire ce qui me semble nécessaire. My decision stands. Now let's get to work.
Classic French moment. Put that one on r/instant karma. Nothing else really happens of note here. This mission really just serves to set the stage for the next one that also takes place in France. You capture a small village near the coast, after which the day is yours. Where Bannon's fuck-ups really start to matter is in the next mission, Deep Strike. Parker is ordered to lead an attack on a different village this time, while Bannon is told he is going to be in reserve, supporting the French. And he gets very soy cringe about it.
But sir, we might miss the battle!
Man, shut your...
The uphill struggle for Parker ends in success, though once the village is captured, the Russians send out a strike force to attack from the rear flank. I actually quite enjoyed this part of the mission. You do not have a lot of time to react, and it was kind of cool to watch my tanks blasting back through the town I just captured to go and defend. Bannon disobeys direct orders and leaves the French division to save the day, which he does. At least for Parker.
Yeah, that got those commie bastards!
Bannon, you goddamn cowboy! You are to return to the Commandant!
Eagle 6 come in! They're all around us! Merde! It's an ambush! Mais on est perdu! C'est la...
Commandant, come in! Bannon, get back to the Commandant at once! That's a direct order!
Yes, sir! Moving there now!
And here's this big conflict that has been teased at us throughout the entire game thus far. Bannon disobeyed orders and got a French commander, as well as probably hundreds of more men, killed. I mean, I told you it wasn't that interesting. This isn't the last time we'll learn of something he's fucked up in the past either. And the thing is that he doesn't even learn anything from this particular squander. We'll get to that soon though, because we switch back to the Russians for the next mission, where there isn't very much for me to say. Lightning Strike is a complete filler mission, which is something I didn't expect from the Soviet assault expansion. After all, with only 6 missions to develop the narrative around Orlovsky and his men, it seems strange to me that they would waste time like this. It's uncharacteristically different compared to the effort that went into the last 3 chapters. There are only 2 more Soviet assault missions after this one, and we're not even getting any worthwhile story. We do, however, get some background information about Malashenko in the form of a letter to his wife during the loading screen, where his delusions about the Soviet Union, as well as the war, are reinforced.
Don't mind Mother. She's just set in her ways, just like Uncle Vladimir. He is a wary commander and I fear he cares too much for the men. I care for them too, but we are fighting a war and sacrifice.
I'm so proud of you, my love. They say that we will have victory soon. I look forward to having you home, and safe, and raising our daughter together in this new world which you are shaping.
We should name her Anastasia. Or maybe Nadezhda. That would make Mother happy. Take care, Mashenka. All of you. Love, Nikolai.
Lightning Strike is also set back to not long after the invasion. The Russian response to this stalemate in Europe is a naval landing in Norway. The plan is to knock out anti-air defenses behind NATO lines, to allow Soviet bombers to fly in and open up an opportunity for a renewed assault, while also targeting some oil rigs, cause why the fuck not? And who else to put in charge of this operation other than Orlovsky? In order to maximize the chances of a quick victory, the Soviets take advantage of their experimental Ekrano plans. I think these ones are meant to be based off of the famous Caspian Sea monster, of which only one was ever built. The Soviets in this universe have at least 6 of them. Which is fine if they do, it just makes me doubt the whole cargo ship meme from the start of the campaign even more. Surely some of these bad boys would have come in handy. I highly recommend you watch Bald and Bankrupt's Caspian Sea Monster video, by the way. The mission is, of course, a success, during the course of which you also get to play around with a brand new developmental Soviet support weapon, which is just a giant incendiary bomb. Very effective. However, you learn at the end that while you were busy in Norway, the Americans were doing a little bit of trolling on their own. And thus, our perspective switches back to Sawyer yet again. He raises his doubts about Bannon over the phone to the same pencil pusher that deployed him in France, which is basically met with the answer, deal with it. Even though in any other case, Bannon would be court-martialed over his part in the death of the French commandant from the previous mission, there aren't enough officers in active duty to replace him, which checks out from what we learned previously. Sawyer is then told that he will be taking part in a covert reconnaissance mission in the Murmansk region, in command of a Norwegian Ranger division. A B-2 Spirit bomber, which is a prototype at the time that this game is set, has been shot down in the area. It carried top-secret information that has to be retrieved, and the surviving pilots are to be rescued. I like how this mission starts out. You are once again limited to a certain number of units. At least in the beginning, these 4 Ranger squads is all you get. They're a lot of fun to use, too. They're absolutely deadly against infantry, though they don't have any anti-tank weaponry. Instead, they have the special ability to call in artillery support. It makes for some fun gameplay as you have to get within range to call this barrage in, meaning that you either have to find a way to approach vehicles under the cover of forest, or you have to take the risk and charge out in the open, trying to take as little damage as possible. Where it all falls apart is towards the end, where I was able to call in so many new units that I couldn't even select them all. It's here that I learned that the game doesn't let you select more than 16 units at any given time. From then on, the mission quite frankly became a piece of piss, as some might say. I had so many units on my screen at one point that I started losing frames. The mission is a success for the most part. The information is secured and the wreckage is destroyed. However, as the search for the missing pilots goes underway, we learn that a Soviet response team has been deployed. This gives us a time limit of 35 minutes, which, seeing how I managed to finish the mission with over 18 minutes to spare, makes what takes place next even more unnecessary. Bannon offers to send his units out to flank the Russian response team, buying us the time that we so desperately need to complete our mission.
That actually might delay them, Bannon. Do it.
For some bizarre reason, Sawyer agrees to this, and in full Bannon fashion, he fucks up yet again, shooting and killing a group of Russian soldiers attempting to surrender. Or at least I think it's meant to be soldiers. They sure look like soldiers to me, but the game mentions later that rumors amongst the men are circulating that Bannon killed civilians. But if that's the case, not only is this extremely poorly communicated, they were wearing helmets and shit for fuck's sakes, then it still doesn't change the fact that this time, I don't think it's as big of a deal as Sawyer is making it out to be. I mean, this is a secret mission behind enemy lines. Even if you did take them as prisoners, where the hell are you going to put them? It's not a great thing that he ended up killing them, especially how he somehow mistook them for attacking him. But I mean, what else could he have done? Let them go so they can relay their position to another unit? Killing them was probably the only real solution in this case. So I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think Bannon should be cut some slack here. I know, I'm really breaking some new ground in this video, huh? And if they really were civilians, well, tough shit. Maybe run away from the tanks next time. As the next mission loads up, we finally get some much needed character development for Bannon, as he makes a phone call to his mother. How he is allowed to do so behind enemy lines is beyond me though. At least he doesn't give away any sensitive information.
Harriet Bannon.
Hey Mom, it's Mark.
Marky, are you okay? Where are you?
Look, I know I haven't called in a while. I'm sorry. We've been kind of isolated.
But where are you?
Not in France. Is Earl around?
He's out hunting rabbits with Frank and Emmett. Listen, how are you, Mark? Really, your letters, well...
Wish I could come home, Mom. I thought I'd do some good here, you know? Something Dad would have been proud of, but it's all just kind of screwed up.
Listen, honey, I'm proud of you. And I'm sure your father would have been too.
Yeah, well, you shouldn't be. I've done wrong. Some things.
If you did, you didn't have any choice.
I don't know, Mom. Hey, Earl always drinks when he hunts. He hasn't...
A little.
God damn it, Mom, you said you'd leave him if he did.
Mark, it's not easy. Where would I go?
Anywhere he's not. That son of a...
He's my husband, Mark.
Okay, Mom, whatever. Look, I gotta go. Gotta kill some more commies and make Earl proud. Take care.
Mark?
I mean, it's something, I suppose, but at least for me, it's too little too late. The only reason I really even remotely enjoy this character is because of how much of a dick he is to Parker for no reason.
That took you long enough, Parker. Glad you could spare some of your precious time to help out.
If the writers wanted to give me a reason to care about him, then they should have done so a lot earlier. At least Sawyer seems to be of a similar opinion, at least for the time being, making sure that Bannon knows that there will be consequences to his actions once they are back home, which they are told will be after this final mission in Russia. One observation I have about Bannon's current arc, though, is that it has some similarities to another character in Soviet Assault, Malashenko. Both of them seem to be living in a little bit of a fantasy world, one constructed out of propaganda and the ideal versions of their respective militaries. Join the army and make a difference is probably something that Bannon was told during recruitment, just as Malashenko was fed the idea that the Soviet army was going to be the force that liberates the West from its oppressive governments. And I guess the idea is that one of the characters is able to come through to the other side and somewhat get their act together, whereas the other one is a lost cause. But let's move on. The intel discovered in the downed B-2 showed that a large number of Soviet nuclear submarines are stationed at a dock near Murmansk. So since Sawyer is already in the vicinity with his battle group, he is tasked with capturing and destroying them. That's about it. Bannon fucks up again and lets a submarine escape. Look at the fucking speed! I think by the end they only managed to capture 2 submarines, though that's still better than none. It's back to America from here. Intel found on one of the subs suggests an incoming attack on the East Coast, and several US divisions, including Sawyer's company, are being called back to defend. Which means that this whole flashback sequence still isn't done. Holy fuck. But before that, we're back with the Russians for the second last time. After their invasion of Norway, Orlovsky and his men are sent to Murmansk to defend against the American invasion that we just took part in as Parker. Which seems a little silly moving this poor guy and his entire battalion from place to place like this. Is there really no other companies in the entire Soviet Union that could go there to defend? No wonder they're having trouble. While Sawyer and his company got sent back home after capturing the dockyard, NATO used this opportunity to launch an offensive directly into Russian territory. As Orlovsky prepares to set up defenses, Malashenko receives some grave news that quite nicely sets him up to developing into the character that he is going to become in the post-American invasion timeline.
Kolya, it's your wife. Masha? She...
Что?
They're dead, Kolya. She and your daughter. Killed yesterday when the Americans raided Serbryansk. I'm so sorry.
Sorry. You're at war. They died for the state. They died for socialism. I'm proud.
You have my deepest
sympathy. I don't want sympathy. I want leaders with the courage to prevent NATO from walking into our soil.
Kolya, we're dealing with a strong adversary.
Then we must be stronger!
Comrade Colonel, our forward scouts report inbound NATO helicopters.
Where the hell is Romanov and the Shilkas? Kolya, can I count on you?
Let them come, Uncle. Let them come.
With this new development in his life, it should be no surprise that Malashenko is going to become a lot less sympathetic towards both his enemies as well as his uncle, whose willingness to fight is only going to dwindle as time goes on, blaming not the side that started this war, but the one that is retaliating. And I suppose, if these really were civilians in the American mission earlier, that Malashenko's wife and daughter may have died at the hands of Bannon, though I don't really find these types of coincidences to be very interesting. As for the mission itself, Romanov takes up a support role, being put in charge of several self-propelled artillery guns. It's a nice change of pace from the usual gameplay loop. Malashenko is split up between 2 separate defense points, and you have to divide your firepower in a way where you can effectively cover both fronts. However, it's a change of pace that's here to stay for the next 2 missions also, and I found myself getting a little tired of it. Having to rely on the AI to be able to hold these points without taking too many casualties proved to be a test of patience, especially because, similar to your own units throughout the game, they struggle to prioritize important targets. If you found the micromanaging up to this point to already be a little annoying, then this is ramped up by a factor of 5. The enemy AI also has the tendency to rush objectives, something I haven't mentioned earlier because it's quite easy to deal with as the player. But friendly AI really struggles with these rush tactics, and that really shows in these types types of missions. There is also this one objective that I need to mention. You're told to link up with a helicopter squadron very close to where you are stationed. What the game doesn't tell you is that, to do this, you need to move all of your units onto the objective marker to proceed. It took me a while to realize this. I first moved just one unit onto the point. Nothing happened. I tried moving two onto it. Still nothing. I tried moving them to the edge of the map too, where all I had to do was move all of my units this short distance and I was able to proceed. That was a little annoying to say the least. Could have just gave me the helicopters, I was right there. Nevertheless, this mission ends with a Pyrrhic victory. You are told that the Russians took major losses as our perspective shifts back to the Americans in New York. The intelligence found aboard one of the Russian submarines from the previous American mission was correct. A few days later, New York is attacked by a Spetsnaz regiment. We're not told how they got there though. Numerous docks across the east coast were bombarded by a number of Russian submarines, but I don't see how any infantry could have reasonably landed there. I guess the Americans couldn't be asked placing some Hawk batteries along the coast of their major cities within this time, go figure. That or the short-ranged AA units that are available in the game with the effective range of my spit are all the US has to offer in this universe. Or maybe the Spetsnaz were sent in underwater. Judging by the Western Navy's dreadful performance, I guess that's the only real option. Finally, we have reached the last mission of this long flashback arc. We learn that Parker is due to go home to Seattle for a week, and Bannon is also being sent there to join a supply division, which made me wonder about what Parker must do for fun during his time off. What do you think? I imagine he just hibernates in his room until a new war breaks out. That at least explains how two of our characters end up in Seattle. As for Sawyer, your guess is as good as mine. I guess he just gets sent there when shit goes down. This is around the time that Sawyer first asks Webb to come out of retirement too, by the way. For the one person that cares. The Spetsnaz divisions that landed on Liberty Island and its surrounding masses were able to commandeer a large number of American vehicles that were stationed there, holding their crews hostage. I guess it's kind of cool to fight against US vehicles playing as the Americans, but nothing has changed mechanically. I thought that maybe they were going to do the meme where you have to try and differentiate friends from foes, but it never goes anywhere near that direction. I will at least give the game credit for this probably being one of the game's most distinct maps. Having to hop between all of these islands is a nice change for gameplay. Parker is tasked with commanding a helicopter squadron, supporting Captain Vance as he lands troops on the islands. Ellis Island is first, and it was pretty easy for the most part. It's a small piece of the map with not that many enemy units. It wasn't until Governor's Island that the shit show really took off. It hosts a quite frankly ridiculous number of Spetsnaz units and heavy tanks, and way too many AA and anti-ship units to not have been able to defend the island effectively in the first place. And since you're not allowed to drop in any ground units of your own, leaving the entire assault and capturing of objectives to Vance, you really have to do some heavy lifting with the few helicopters that you have available at any time. There is also a secondary objective here that you can achieve if you do not lose 10 or more helicopters throughout the entire mission, and it's one of the few ones where you get nothing for completing it. At the very least, it's not super hard to do, since Bannon has been put on repair duty. You can fly your helicopters over to him at any time to fix them right up, free of charge. Once the slog at Governor's Island is finished, Sawyer lets us know that Soviet units bunkered up in Liberty Island are preparing to release a chemical agent, demanding the withdrawal of American troops from Europe as ransom. Sawyer, it seems, is in a bit of a cheeky mood, because he orders an airstrike to completely eviscerate the Statue of Liberty in response, though he also orders Parker to move in and try to kill the Soviets there before that happens, in which case he would call off the bombardment. This is probably the most enjoyable part of the mission for me. I like when the game gives me a time limit to work around. There have been previous missions where similar restraints were set, and for the most part, I enjoyed all of them. Parker, of course, saves the day, as well as the Statue of Liberty.
I see green smoke! Tell them to abort, damn it!
This is Eagle 6! Abort! Abort! Abort!
Good work, Parker.
After one final push on a different island, we can finally conclude this whole backstory section, leaving us with just 5 more missions to talk about. Let's go get them. Aftermath takes us back to the morning after the nuclear explosion at Cascade Falls, though we are also shown Bannon's mother listening to a voice message he sent her not long before the Russian assault on Cascade Falls began. It's a decent enough way to reintroduce us back to the game's current time, reminding us that Bannon is now dead. He's dead, right? Remember that he died? So I should probably explain what I'm trying to do here. I swear I remember Bannon coming back to life towards the end of the game. In fact, I would have bet my fucking left nut on it. I don't mean he gets like reanimated, but I could have sworn that he somehow survived the blast and then he came back in the end to save the day. Well, little did I know when I started replaying this game for this video that I was wrong. Bannon is actually dead for good, meaning that I am now nutless. I prefer it this way though, it actually redeems the character for me a little bit. Ultimate sacrifice and all that. This scene kind of reeks of Bannon somehow being able to foresee that he's not going to get out of this battle alive, which never sits right with me when stories do this sort of thing. But maybe that's not a fair criticism, since the Cascade Falls battle really is an all-or-nothing assault, so I guess I'm indifferent about it in the end.
I'm gonna do good tomorrow, though. God knows I've screwed things up before, and I probably should have stayed out of the army in the first place instead of signing up because of what I thought Dad would think. Well, that doesn't really matter now. Tomorrow, I'm gonna do good. No matter what it takes. Take care, okay? Bye, Mom. I love you.
Not a lot happens in terms of story in the actual mission itself. The Soviets were successfully scattered and have started to fall back towards Seattle. The Americans aren't doing a whole lot better themselves, though. The surviving divisions led by Sawyer, Webb, and Parker were split up in the chaotic retreat, unable to reach each other over the radio due to the electromagnetic radiation in the area. Parker manages to find Webb though. He intercepts his radio message and they meet up not long after. Thank goodness he was literally just down the road. It would probably help too if Parker's neurodivergent ass could just reply, like say something, man.
Alpha 6 to Bravo 6. Webb to Parker. Come in. If you're getting this, I want you to rendezvous with me at the ford by the old mill.
Parker managed to save a couple of armored repair vehicles, which sucks for the player, because now we're stuck on bitch repair duty. Yeah, I didn't really like this mission that much. It was probably the lowest point in the game for me gameplay-wise. You have to try your best to keep Webb from losing too many units throughout the entire mission, which if you remember my criticisms of the AI from earlier, shouldn't be too much of a surprise as for why I didn't really enjoy this. At the very least, as you find abandoned vehicles around the map, you do gain control of a limited number of them, making this whole ordeal at least a little bit less frustrating. At least then I could protect Webb a little with some of these medium tanks instead of just having to pray that the enemy doesn't hardlock onto my repair vehicles as I'm trying to keep his ass alive. I appreciate the attempt to switch the gameplay up, but having just played the support role for 2 whole missions prior to this, I kind of wish the roles were reversed. I think that if the player got to control most of the units, with the repairs being left up to Webb, then this whole section would have landed a lot better. At least for me. There are Russians scattered all over the place, and as you slowly go around and clear them out, Webb manages to get in contact with Sawyer.
Eagle 6 to all units. Anyone out there? Over.
The Russians managed to regain enough cohesion to launch an attack on our position, though thanks to our re-established contact with our support units, this attack is defeated, and the Russians officially begin a full retreat towards the coast. Sawyer sets a rally point, and off we go to find him. Mission complete. One thing I didn't show in the Cascade Falls mission is the scene of Anton desperately looking for Mike in the battlefield. This gets resolved at the end of Aftermath. Mike was lightly wounded during the retreat out of the decimated town. He'll be back in the fight in a matter of days. And just in case you forgot, how could you? He still has his CD player.
Thanks for coming to see me, Ants. You! I just wanted that fancy new CD player of yours! Go to hell! I'll meet you at the rallying point!
And if you're sitting there right now thinking to yourself, why did you even bother showing that scene in this video? Well, that's exactly my point. But enough of that homoerotic cringe. Because one of the stories in World in Conflict is now coming to an end. And is doing so with the aptly named mission, Fratricide. Okay, well, actually, Fratricide isn't the next mission following Aftermath. That honor, for what it's worth, goes to Once More Onto the Breach. However, since we just witnessed how the Americans were dealing with the blast in Cascade Falls, I think it's only fitting to check on how the Soviets managed to handle it. The final Soviet assault mission opens up with a final open talk between Orlovsky and Lebechev. Old Vladdy's mind is made up about what he's going to do next, and Lebechev doesn't take much convincing either.
There is no room for the truth on that machine.
That's a dangerous word, Volodya. Truth. Such an ambiguous concept.
Stop it, Valery. We are defeated here. I know it and you know it too.
I'm afraid that Moscow cannot accept.
I am not talking to Moscow. I am talking to you.
And what exactly are you telling me?
That I did not bring my men to America to commit mass suicide. And what is coming, I will need you with me.
You can count on me, Volodya.
I hope so, Valery. Now, put that thing on and we'll get this done.
Very well.
We get to hear more from Lebechev in the briefing after this cutscene as well. He's disturbed at the lengths that the Americans were willing to go to in order to stop the Soviet advance, putting emphasis on the nuclear bombing of one of their own towns as something that even they themselves could never do. Something that we find out in the American mission before this one is that the Chinese have now joined the war on the side of the USSR. It's the only real big plot point that is revealed in that mission, but even with this information, it's clear to at least two of these commanders that their efforts in America are futile, and really that they always were. This whole final mission centers around trying to get a convoy of wounded soldiers away from Cascade Falls. Malashenko is still under the assumption that they are headed to Seattle to link up with an approaching Chinese fleet, and in fact he suggests that leaving the wounded behind would allow them to get there faster. Though in reality, Orlovsky is trying to lead them to the coast to get his men back to Russia. This is another helicopter support mission. I'm not going to beat this dead horse any longer, though as a final nail in the AI coffin, I'll show you this clip. All the AI has to do here is sit on the objective for like 15 seconds to capture it and progress the mission. I'm providing plenty of fire support for them to be able to do so. It won't though. Not until every enemy unit within a fucking kilometer radius has been killed. It's like unintentional padding. There are a few interactions between Orlovsky and Malashenko that happen throughout the course of this mission that I quite enjoyed. Malashenko goes on his usual shit about how they will crush every last American unit and that victory is still to come. And Orlovsky just unenthusiastically goes along with it, just to shut him up.
We will go to Seattle and let the Americans destroy themselves by attacking us.
Yes, of course, Captain. Now secure that command post.
I also like that Orlovsky is still trying to keep up appearances for his men, trying to play the character they expect him to be.
Yeah, so-called one. The Americans are trying to surround us, but they will not succeed. They needed a nuclear bomb to stop our brave comrades at Cascade Falls. And they will need another one to stop us now.
After a decently long fight, and a long crawl to the final area of the map, the convoy reaches its initial extraction point, after which we get to experience the climax of the Soviet assault story, Malashenko's betrayal of Orlovsky.
If we go to Seattle, we'll die in Seattle. The Americans will never allow the Chinese to land. We saw in Cascade Falls how far they are willing to go.
What exactly are you saying?
We're not going to Seattle. I've made preparations to take the men home. A ship is expecting us at this location tonight.
What? And betray our country?
It's the right thing to do. I'll accept full responsibility.
Were you aware of this?
He's not in command here. I am. Please try to understand, Nikolai.
I am Captain Malashenko of the Soviet Army, and you are acting like a traitor.
I'm doing this for the men, Kolya.
Those men don't belong to you. They belong to the state. My wife and daughter didn't die so that you can turn tail and run.
But we don't belong here. This entire venture has been a full...
Thank you, comrade. Thank you. He was a traitor.
I'm taking my company to Seattle.
I'll bring the battalion. To victory.
To victory.
Time to choose, old friend. To all Sokol elements, this is Major Lebedev. The Colonel is dead. I am taking command.
So I won't lie to you. I had to watch this scene over a couple of times to really try and understand what the hell happened here, because my initial reaction was pretty mixed. I think Lebedev's delivery of a few of the lines is to blame for this. The first time I heard him say this line,
"Time to choose, old friend,"
it sounded to me like he was mocking Orlovsky. However, knowing the context of what happens directly after this leads me to believe that this was not the writer's intention. And other than this slight hiccup, I think this is a great scene. I like this act that Lebedev does after Malashenko kills Orlovsky. It's comedic how unconvincing he is with this act he's pulling, and yet somehow it works, letting him off the hook. The only real criticisms I have about all of this is that there was no one else around to witness the murder that just took place. No guards outside the tent that could react to what just happened. How convenient. And no questions asked when the Colonel is announced to be dead. Not to mention that Romanov was specifically excluded from this meeting, like he'd be able to do anything about it anyway. I don't think we actually ever get to see any sort of player model for the Russian protagonist like we do for Parker. Maybe he'll haunt Malashenko for this, I don't know. It's also a little weird that Orlovsky let this confrontation happen in the first place. I mean, I don't really believe he thought Malashenko would just take this decision to retreat and run with it, considering everything we've learned about him up to this point. He really has nothing left to lose. He even brings this point up in the form of his dead family, so it's no surprise that things could have ended up like this. But on the other hand, Orlovsky's objective is to get everyone home, safe and sound. Malashenko is one of these men, like it or not, and maybe he was hoping to be able to convince him. A foolish idea met with a foolish fate. Who the fuck let me cook? But it's not quite over yet. Lebedev now takes command of the remaining Russian forces, and that reason I mentioned for why I know he wasn't mocking Orlovsky in the previous scene is that he continues to carry out what the Colonel had already started. He made his choice, just as Orlovsky did much earlier on. The convoy that we've been escorting up to this point is well on its way to the west coast, but we are tasked with stopping an American advance to make sure that it gets there safely. Seeing Lebedev in command is pretty interesting. It's clear that he's nowhere near as confident as Orlovsky or Malashenko for that matter, and that makes sense. Not only could his performance in the cutscene we just witnessed be telling of some inherent cowardice on his part, he did also allude to the fact way in the beginning of this game that he's only been able to get to where he is now because of his father-in-law. It's some nice attention to detail that I'm glad was included. Lebedev attempts to contact Malashenko, but fails. He blames it on him probably not switching the radio over to the new frequency he just announced, though I think it's safe to say he's probably tuned himself out on purpose. We never find out what happens to Malashenko after this. Though, knowing how the game ends, it's probably safe to assume that he led his troops onwards to Seattle, towards their inevitable demise. That's the only thing he has left to do, after all, and it's a fitting end for this character. The game is kind enough to give you some heavy tanks in this section, which was well needed. The Americans sent in a lot of AA missile batteries, which dealt quite a lot of damage to my helicopters, whereas I ended up keeping all of my tanks till the end. We get a final commendation from Lebedev, thanking us for saving everyone's lives, as the screen fades to black. And then this cutscene plays.
They say you're asking me for papers.
I'm sorry, Comrade Major, but since Colonel Orlovsky is dead, I can't
Captain,
without
do
verifying...
you know who Comrade Minister Kravchenko is?
Of course. He is the Minister of Defense.
And my father-in-law. Do this, and I'll make sure you're duly rewarded for your selfless service to the state.
Major, without some confirmation, I simply
And then again, I could just have my men shoot you. Perhaps your second in command is more willing to listen.
We'll leave with the tide.
Good choice. Tell the men.
So I was kind of lost for words on this one, not gonna lie. This sudden change in character isn't actually coming out of nowhere like it might seem at first. In all fairness, this is only the second time we ever see Lebechev interacting with anyone other than the main cast of this campaign. The first time was in the very first cutscene that set this whole game off. That initial interaction between himself and Orlovsky served a purpose. I think this is how he behaves when he isn't around people he can trust. I think that the toned down version of him that we've been seeing for the vast majority of the Soviet assault campaign is his true personality. At least I hope it is. One that was only allowed to show itself when in the presence of his good old friend. And since he's dead now, it's back to business as usual. This weird sudden change in this character was still quite jarring nonetheless. The only thing I like about this cutscene is that he's going out the same way he first came into the game, in that same car. It's pretty baller. And I suppose that this is a fitting place to give some final thoughts about the Soviet Assault expansion as its own separate entity. Gameplay-wise, it was pretty much more of the same. I'll have a much more thorough conclusion of that in the final section of this video. But I must stress that this is hands down the best story I have ever experienced in any real-time strategy game, no question about it. I have no idea how Massive Entertainment was given the go-ahead to put so much time and energy into creating these characters, these cutscenes, and to be able to put something decent on paper, because nothing was forcing them to do any of this as far as I can tell. They had a vision for something that worked to greatly improve an already solid story foundation, and I'm just so glad that they were able to see it through. We still have more of the main campaign to go through, and even with everything I have criticized about the American side of the story so far, that campaign alone is still worthy of so much praise for the things it did right. So to actually go through the effort of creating an expansion that adds a whole other superior campaign in my opinion, even if there are still some flaws present, is frankly an incredible event. And it's one that we will sadly probably never see done again within this niche genre of video games. And because of that, I think it deserves eternal praise. And with that bittersweet conclusion, it's time to wave goodbye to Soviet Assault, and return to Sawyer, Webb, and Parker for this final stretch of the game.
But we didn't fail at Cascade Falls, sir.
When I'm forced to sacrifice a company of my men and drop a nuclear weapon on my own country, call it a goddamn failure. I won't let it happen again.
So now we have to move back one mission to once more onto the breach. We witness the President of the United States learning that the Chinese have just joined the war on the Russian side, and he's basically presented with three options. The first is to move 2 divisions out of Europe and into Seattle to defend it against the incoming Chinese invasion, which would probably result in a complete defeat in Europe. I don't really know if 2 divisions would really make enough of a difference to cause a defeat in Europe. It's almost like the writers keep forgetting that the Western Europeans still have armies of their own. The other option is to wait for the Chinese to land in Seattle, after which a nuclear strike would be called in to wipe the entire city off the map. He is, however, presented with a third Hail Mary plan. Send in the battered battalion from Cascade Falls under the command of Sawyer. And thus, our objective is set. Get to Seattle as quickly as possible to avoid another Cascade Falls. This is the first mission in some time now where we get to use more than just support units, and it feels all the sweeter for it. Not to mention the fact that it's already a pretty challenging mission to begin with, making it somewhat of a return to form in my book. I do want to point out another flaw in the game's deployment system that I took note of though. You are given a lot of points to spend here, and since you can spawn heavy tanks, there's literally zero incentive to use any other unit, other than maybe the odd Humvee for repairs. Heavy tanks are just so much better than pretty much anything else in the game that I think there should have been a capacity limit for them, at least if the intention is to have a wider variety of units under your command. That, or they could have let us use some infantry too. This map is perfect for them with a vast amount of buildings and forests everywhere. I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity. But there isn't much more to say about this one, other than a slight change in Sawyer's behavior. He really wants to avoid another nuclear attack on US soil, understandably so, and his demeanor becomes a lot more desperate throughout the whole mission.
Why are we not making any progress, people? Get this goddamn show on the road!
It's probably one of the few times that the base campaign does something that's somewhat on par with the expansion. There is also this weird bug I encountered in this mission where my units didn't want to build up fortifications after capturing an objective. I sat on this one for way longer than I had to because of this. I don't really know what caused this bug, but I got around it by zooming in and closely watching the progress bar until it filled up to the end. For whatever reason, that seemed to make it work. Victory over the Russians is achieved, and we send them running ever closer to Seattle. That's one mission down, 2 more to go. We take a break from mainland Washington state in the pre-ultimate mission of this campaign, instead being sent to an island off of its coast under the command of what is now Major Webb, who also receives a little bit of exposition. Shotty sitting there like, damn.
Hey baby, it's me. Pick up the phone. I know you're there. Look, I'm sorry, Nicole. Please pick up.
James, I just don't have anything more to say to you.
But we're talking right now, aren't we? I'm real sorry, Nicole. But you know I had to do this.
No, you didn't. You could have stayed here with me. I just can't handle it, Jamie. If you die...
Yeah, look, I'm sorry, but I don't really care about any of this. One of the reasons for why I cared about the Soviet assault characters is that they were introduced early on, they were charismatic, and their stories got constant development throughout the campaign. There was hardly a dull moment for them, minus that one filler mission that I talked about already. Any information we learned about things like the characters' families and other bits of backstory was told to us for a reason. Malashenko's wife and child weren't just brought up for the sake of being brought up. Their deaths had a massive impact on how the character was going to behave during the invasion of America. The problem with the game trying to make you care for people like Webb or even Anton and Mike is that they just fucking appeared like 2 or 3 missions in with nothing interesting or important to add. So let's just keep going. The islands we are tasked with taking back hold Russian anti-ship emplacements that will be necessary in the defense of Seattle from the approaching Chinese fleet, making them quite strategically important. But before we get into the mission itself, here's something I noticed about the narrator for these loading screen briefings. Now, I only caught on to this because he started referring to Sawyer from the third-person perspective. I just thought it was kind of weird. I always thought it was Sawyer speaking in these. It sounds like him, to me at least. And I mean, it makes sense that the person in charge of these operations would be the one to be narrating here. But it's not Sawyer. Can you guess who it is? It's fucking Parker. Yep, that's right. Parker was the one narrating these from the very beginning. It's confirmed in the last mission, and I'll be sure to point it out when we get there. But this also now brings up the question of who the narrator on the Russian side is now, because I thought those were done by either Lebechev or Orlovsky, but there's nothing stopping them from being meant to be read by Romanov. I just don't know. We're never outright told who is meant to be narrating these. I wish it was made more clear. I picked up on the fact that Parker was narrating purely by chance, as you will see later. But we have this mission to go through first, and it has a pretty strong start. You need to clear out 3 objective markers on the coast without the ability to deploy units, with no support assets, whilst also being on a short timer. Good stuff. And the rest of the mission is pretty cool too. There's a heavy focus on infantry combat here, which I'm quite a fan of, as I mentioned, and the map accommodates that well with numerous forests and buildings to take cover in. But where I started to get a little bit disappointed is when I managed to complete it in just over 20 minutes, which not only falls on the shorter side of all of the other missions up until this point, this is the second last mission of the entire game, and I was expecting a little bit more of a challenge. I mean, there are a grand total of 3 objectives to complete here, for fuck's sake. This is the only time we get to control anything close to an amphibious invasion, which is pretty neat, but it doesn't last long, and I couldn't help but start to feel that this ending was a little bit rushed, something that we'll see more of in the final battle in Seattle. I have one more big point to bring up about one of the game's mechanics, the support system. It's the last big point I'll be making about any of these features. There are numerous times throughout the campaign where you are tasked with destroying certain specific vehicles or buildings on the map, either in the form of a primary or secondary objective. In this second last mission specifically, you have the secondary objective to destroy a number of anti-air vehicles scattered around the map. The fact that the cargo planes with which you deploy more units, or any other aircraft that you call in with support points, are invulnerable to any damage in the game is kind of scuffed. And this was especially apparent to me when I destroyed these anti-air emplacements by calling close air support on them. I think there should be some sort of risk to doing this, and it's actually a way in which regiments vastly improved on the whole call-in support concept. Because try bombing an AA vehicle in that game, and your jet will either rout or be destroyed, which is more how it should be, I think. And having said that, I guess it's time. The Chinese fleet is approaching after all, and I think I've stretched this video out enough past the 8-minute mark to be able to monetize it now.
Thompson residence. Martha Thompson speaking.
Mom?
Michael, is that you? Where are you? How are you?
Listen, Mom, we don't have much time. This is my 4th try. We might get cut off at any second.
I thought the phones didn't work since the attack.
They do sometimes. Mom, listen. You have to get out of Seattle.
How, Michael? More soldiers on the streets? There's a curfew after 5, and they shoot anyone who breaks it. They shot at Mrs. Flanagan, and all she was doing was...
Not now, Mom. You have
to get out. I don't care how. Maybe you could sneak through the sewers or something.
Good God, through the sewers? This is my home, Michael, and I'm not leaving it for those Russian pigs to loot. If your father was alive, he'd say the same thing.
Mom, the president has ordered that if...
What? Michael, I can't hear you.
If we fail...
Damn it, just try to get out, Mom.
No, Michael, you won't fail, whatever it is. And I'm going to stay here until this thing is over and done with.
Mom! Damn it.
So this is it. After almost 2 hours into this video, we're finally at the last assault to take back Seattle. And if you were wondering how I know that the narrator in the American campaign is in fact Parker, well, here's your proof.
And when the Colonel finally called us together for a final briefing, Major Webb took me aside. "He might have led us too far this time, Parker," he said. "Just be careful, okay?"
I guess it's possible I've missed something before the last mission of the game that revealed this fact to us, but I feel like I've been paying pretty good attention throughout the whole campaign, and yet this is the first time I realized this. What happens next is... well, it's something. It's a pretty long one, and I was debating whether I wanted to even show the whole thing, but I mean, just look at this. It's like the fucking Somnium Files all over again.
You're listening to Radio Free Seattle, and today we have a special guest here in the studio. The Honorable Reverend Powell has a thing or two to say about the Soviet occupation.
Tell him, Reverend!
I know that we're in a time of war. My brothers and my sisters, trouble don't last always. Over every mountain and through every valley, we shall prevail. Power to the faint and to those that have no might. Your strength shall be increased. We must never give up. You got to hold on till every battle has been fought and every victory has been won. We're gonna shout hallelujah. 'Tis over and 'tis done. No need to worry and no need to cry. I can see the dawning of a brand new day. You're gonna make it. You're gonna make it. We're gonna be victorious.
We join Sawyer briefing Webb and Parker on the upcoming assault. There's a lot at stake in the coming hours, and it seems to be weighing on him a fair bit. He's extremely short-tempered with even the slightest challenge.
But if we tried a flanking move...
Don't you think I've looked at all the alternatives? I've done nothing but that. This is the only way.
But sir, they'll expect us...
Major. You have both been informed of the battle plan. I expect you to do your utmost to execute it.
We learn that Colonel Wilkins is also meant to be joining the fight, but he's been held off by a Russian battalion somewhere else. It's up to Webb and Parker to take the city within the hour, as Sawyer says. Or 45 minutes, as the game says. I bet. At least we have God on our side now. You are once again given access to heavy tanks, so guess what I decided to take? I actually did call in an AA missile vehicle, expecting the worst from the grand finale of the game. That ended up being completely unnecessary, at least this early on. The Russians don't bring out any helicopters for the first 2 objectives. I then had to drag this fucking thing around and protect it from enemy fire, which didn't work out in the end. It's not until you finish protecting the second objective from a Russian counterattack that they actually decide to send some helicopters your way, and even then, your deployment points are probably better spent elsewhere. You have the ability to call in fighter jets from the support menu, and to be honest, that's all you really need. I will give the mission credit for at least being a fairly long and difficult fight. There are plenty of objectives you have to clear out on your way to the harbor, and the game sends a good amount of enemy units to stop you, even if sometimes they seemingly come at you from behind. I ended up taking pretty extensive damage to my heavy tanks during this section, which is pretty impressive considering just how hard they are to kill. I ended up spending some of the extra deployment points I received for clearing the way to the harbor on some armored repair vehicles because of that, so at least that's 3 different unit types I've utilized in this mission. You get given a couple MLRS launchers later too, though that doesn't count. I didn't have to call those in. This mission is also host to one of the easiest secondary objectives in the entire game. You're told that the Russians are airdropping equipment into the city not far away from your location, and you are tasked with downing 4 of them. Now, this would be quite difficult if they decided to drop these in random locations, as long as it's not somewhere behind your lines. That would be a bit shit. But no, they airdrop these units directly into the same exact point on the map every single time. So all you have to do to complete this objective is to just keep marking this area for your fighter jets anytime you have enough support points. Supreme 2007 gaming. After clearing and capturing the harbor, we launch an assault directly into the Russians' headquarters that they have set up not far from the coast. We are told that the units inside are elite, some of the best that the Soviets have to offer. This will be one hell of a challenging fight, Parker. Be careful. Too bad for them, my J-dams and artillery shells couldn't give a lesser fuck. A couple of barrages and some pinpoint strikes on the watchtowers surrounding the compound, and I was in and taking the objectives with minimal losses. So a pretty disappointing start, I must say. But at least, it's not quite over yet. Oh no, my friend. Because what you're about to witness is what I consider to be by far the worst cutscene in the game.
The day is ours and Seattle is secure. Well done. Well done indeed. Webb, you're in charge of the mop-up. There will be some who won't surrender. And I want casualty reports from both of you.
Sir, we should all...
Get him, medic! Hang on, James. You're gonna be all right. I should thank you, by the way.
For what, Colonel?
For questioning my judgment when it needed to be questioned.
Don't worry about it, sir. Don't worry.
Where the hell is that medic? God damn them all to hell, they're counterattacking!
I have so many questions. What the hell were you doing just walking around the city like this? 3 of the most important commanders involved in this operation just taking a fucking stroll down the boulevard. No bodyguards present, not even Anton and fucking Mike. Yeah, that was a really smart idea. They even knew and were expecting Russian units to still be scattered around the area, even having just destroyed their HQ. And yet, they still did this shit just so the writers could have had the excuse to get Webb shot and have this cheesy exchange. And I mean, come on, if you're going to pull this sort of crap, then at least have a more developed character get shot. I think it should have been Sawyer, if anyone, that took the bullet, because who the fuck really cares about Webb in the first place? Sawyer sees Webb get shot by a sniper, and instead of trying to get behind cover, he pretty much just stands still, making himself an even easier target to hit. And unless he somehow managed to dome the fucker with one of these shots, which, let's be honest, is unlikely, him just sitting there still in the open with Webb is just such a dumb move that I really think the devs either ran out of time or just didn't give a fuck anymore. There's nothing stopping that sniper from just reappearing and killing him here. And the whole time, Parker is standing there off screen doing sweet FA. What a fucking train wreck. At least the final battle that we take part in after this redeems the ending somewhat. The Russians assemble for one final desperate push to try and retake the city in what proved to be a worthy challenge for this finale. But before we get going with that, allow me to show you how the game trolled me here. Notice the direction in which the game points the camera when I first regain control after the cutscene. The docks we just took over are towards the back in this direction for reference. I noticed I had a lot of deployment points to use up, so I called in some units. And after selecting the drop point, look at where the game decided to point my camera. I didn't catch on to this while playing, and because of that, I set up my units with their backs turned towards the advancing Russians, with all of my squishier units now in the front line of defense. That was a bit of a dick move. I also didn't notice that there were 3 objectives to hold somehow, and I was sitting there wondering why I wasn't building up any fortifications because of that. The bug I encountered a few missions prior didn't do me any favors. When the final Russian assault began, and I realized my 2 big oopsies, we lose contact with the Air Force, meaning no more reinforcements or air support for the time being. We do, however, gain control of some of Webb's units, since he's taking a little break right now. We're told that he's losing a lot of blood, by the way, but he's still alive. Thank goodness for that. I don't know what I would have done with myself if he died. The limitations that the game applies here do nothing but benefit this final battle, even if we're not provided with any real excuse as for why our contact with the Air Force is suddenly lost. We still have access to artillery barrages, and 2 of the units we gain from Webb are MLRS launchers, and since our support is limited, I actually ended up using them quite a fair amount. And so the Russians start pouring in, throwing anything they have at us from APCs to heavy tanks. I actually wish that the game would start throwing even squishier vehicles like jeeps and transport trucks at the objective, maybe even infantry. After all, this is their last-ditch effort to keep their foothold on the United States, so it would be quite cool and funny in a way to see that. Besides, it's entirely possible that Malashenko is in charge of this attack, and throwing absolutely anything he has at his disposal here wouldn't be that out of character for him. At around the 3-minute mark of this intense fighting, I started to lose some vehicles. Now, I'm actually wondering if that was the trigger to move the mission forward. Maybe if I managed to keep all of my units alive, the assault would just keep coming and coming. I kind of doubted though. We regained contact with the Air Force, letting us call in more units, but Colonel Wilkins is still nowhere to be seen. It's not until another solid 3 minutes or so of fighting that we finally hear from him. 3 minutes doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a fairly long chunk of time in the moment. During that time though, I called in a carpet bombing run that managed to wipe out one of my heavy tanks. Look at where the graphics starts. I thought they would be well out of the way from the incoming bombs, but the game pulled one final troll move on me and did this. But yes, 3 minutes is a good amount of time. Your attention is divided between 3 fairly spaced out objectives after all, so you're kept fairly busy. Wilkins arrives and calls in an artillery barrage on the 3 main corridors that the Russians have been advancing through up until now, after which he sends in an armored flanking maneuver from the rear, dealing the one final blow that decides the battle for Seattle.
This is Eagle 6. That was the last of them. I need a medevac for one of my officers. He's been wounded in the shoulder.
Roger that. I'll send one of my ambulances.
Thank you, Colonel. Well, Parker, we actually did it. Seattle is safe, and HQ says the Chinese fleet is turning around. The war isn't over, but at least our homeland is secure once more. And it's due in no small part to you, Parker. I'm proud to have served with you. Eagle 6, out.
But this story isn't quite over yet. We never find out if Webb makes it through, though judging by the fact that he was only hit in the shoulder, he's probably going to be okay. But that's not what I'm referring to, because there is this one story arc that we need to see through to the end. And since the game's been trying to make us care for these characters throughout the runtime of this campaign, we might as well check in on our 2 favorite characters, Mike and Anton.
Thanks, man. So, is it over?
Pretty much. They're rounding up the final stragglers now.
So, I guess we did it, huh?
I guess we did. Hey, so you finally got that thing working?
Yeah, I finally found some batteries. You want to hear it?
Yeah, sure.
Here you go. Yeah, it's good, right?
Yeah. Walk along, lonely state of dreams.
Using White Snake is so cheap, man. I can't really hate this outro because of that. Finally, after over 2 hours, we have seen everything that the campaign of World in Conflict has to offer. Now, one obvious thing I have missed out in this retrospective is the multiplayer mode. I played a grand total of 1 skirmish online back in the day, so I can't really say much about it from experience. And since all of the official servers have been shut for around 6 years now, there's no real way for me to test it out and see if it was any good or not. I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that it was probably decent at the very least, seeing how the community reaction to the server shutdown back in 2016 forced Ubisoft to delay it until later in the year. But to properly gather my final thoughts about World in Conflict, I think it's time to go back to those 2 damn questions I posed way back in the beginning of this video. The thing that really made World in Conflict such a unique RTS game, at least for me, is its unmatched presentation. I haven't played every real-time strategy game ever made, though I cannot think of any other games within this genre that had so much time and effort put into them in that way, either prior to its release or even following it. If you can think of any other games that excel in this way, I would love to hear about them in the comments. But my biggest surprise in revisiting World in Conflict for this video was, without a doubt, seeing just how much Soviet assault improved upon this in every single way. The amount of thought and attention that was put into that specific campaign frankly surpassed all of my expectations, hence why this video is as long as it is, and why I deemed it necessary to analyze it so thoroughly. I think that the setting in which this game takes place is also very unique, definitely for the year it came out at least. I already mentioned that World in Conflict was the first strategy game I played that was set around modern military combat, and it's hard to quantify how much of a breath of fresh air this must have been back in 2007. I suppose just think back to how revolutionary Call of Duty 4 was in that way as well, how every shooter around this time was seemingly set in World War II. I think both of these points add up to making World in Conflict one of the most unique strategy games of its time, which then just leaves us with one final question to answer. Does the game still hold up? And well, I think there are 2 ways we can look at this from. When it comes to presentation, including cutscenes, the overall graphical fidelity of the game, as well as how much of an overall fun time I had playing it, then I think the answer is a very solid yes. However, World in Conflict isn't a perfect game. For 2007, the gameplay that it offered brought some cool new ideas to the table, including the support feature that is still one of the defining aspects of this game for me, as well as a wide variety of objective and mission types that kept the game fresh throughout its runtime. But I think the overall combat in the game feels a little bit dated. I did mention that World in Conflict feels to me like more of a classic style RTS, and if you're after that type of experience, then you can stop listening for like the next 30 seconds. It's kind of a light meme on this channel that I really like realism in games, and to some extent that's true. But that's not due to some weird fetish I have that requires me to play the most realistic simulators available on the market. I do enjoy many games that haven't got a single realism bone in their body. Where I do like realism in games is where the part of a game that is inherently realistic makes the gameplay feel better as a result. An example of this in first-person shooters might be something like headshots. I think that getting shot in the head should result in an instant kill in the vast majority of cases, though there are examples of games where this isn't the case, and yet I still enjoy them. It's really just down to balancing at the end of the day. And to bring this back to World in Conflict, I don't think the fact that it takes something like 4 or 5 shots from a heavy tank to the front armor of an APC to kill it feels good. I think it's a bit of an outdated way to deal with damage in RTS games that is probably the way it is to be more balanced for multiplayer. It feels more like something akin to StarCraft, and I'm glad that things have been going more in the opposite direction in this aspect, especially with Eugen's entries into the genre. Having said all of that though, I'm glad that I decided to revisit World in Conflict. It really is a game that holds a special place in my heart, and I hope that the time and effort I put into talking about it in this video goes to show just how much I still love it, wrinkles and all. So hey, Punished Hub here. That was a long one, huh? If there's one thing you can take away from this video, it's that you should never believe my time estimates. 50 minutes, my ass. Anyway, this video was a lot of fun to make, and I hope that at some point in the future, I'll be able to make more in-depth retrospectives like this one. I actually have a lot of ideas, but that will likely not happen again for a while. The past month I've been so consumed with writing, recording, and editing this project together that I had absolutely zero free time for anything else. I literally just got home from work every day and went straight to my computer to fire up Premiere. I'm not complaining at all though. I hope that everyone enjoyed this video, and I hope that at some point this channel will become more successful enough where I can afford to spend more time working on these. Until then, I'll be coming out with a new review around every month or so, and I promise those will only be around 20 minutes max. We're about to reach 5,000 subscribers any day now, which is just absolutely mind-blowing, honestly. I'm thinking of maybe trying to dabble in some streaming at some point too. Maybe I'll make a subscriber goal, though I don't know. Anyway, that's all I had to say about the channel, and I hope you have a good one. Let's run that outro.
I want you to subscribe to me.
Scav Merchant Hub.
On YouTube, thank you, cringe. Bye.